So around 25 degrees Celsius with a prolonged period of leaf wetness. And additionally, low disease conditions are cold and dry. And we see disease progress throughout the end of the growing season. So in this slide here, you can see a photo on the left taken on July 28th, where we see low disease visually. And then the same field taken on September 1st, we can see a higher amount of disease right at the end of the growing season. I want to briefly talk about the life cycle of Stemphylium vesicarium. When the onions lodge at the end of the growing season, Stemphylium vesicarium overwinters as pseudothecia in crop residue. In the spring, the pseudothecia produces spores called ascospores that infect new plants. And then in June, when conditions are ideal, symptoms will develop, and conidia are found primarily on the lesions on onion plants. And then throughout the growing season, conidia infect onion plants in multiple cycles, resulting in tip dieback until the end of the growing season, when the onions lodge and the cycle continues. Previous work has found that weeds can be an alternative host of Stemphylium leaf blight during the growing season, but it has not been tested if weeds are an overwintering source for the disease, which is currently part of my research, and I'll talk briefly about later. I want to spend a good portion of this presentation talking about disease forecasting. First of all, we know that the overuse of fungicide leads to resistance in the pathogen. We've seen high resistance to Quadris top and Luna tranquility in recent years. We also know that fungal pathogen disease development is affected by different conditions. We mostly look at weather variables like temperature and leaf wetness, but we also want to consider things like previous herbicide or insect damage, and etc. And additionally, we know that accurate forecasting models can recommend a fungicide application schedule that gives similar disease suppression, but with fewer application sprays, so we have less resistance. I want to talk about previous research done in 2018 and 2019 by Dr. Stricker. Part of her research was to compare two forecasting models, the TOMCAST and BSPcast models. TOMCAST was developed for the pathogen Alternaria on tomatoes in Ontario, where the BSPcast model was developed for Stemphylium vesicarium for pears in Spain and Italy. Both of them use temperature and leaf wetness duration to trigger sprays, but the way they do this is different. For the TOMCAST model, it uses a daily disease severity value. So each day is ranked from a 0 to 3 based off of risk. And then these values accumulate until it reaches a certain threshold. For example, 15 is commonly used. And the BSPcast model uses a 3-day cumulative risk factor. So this means that risk is assessed each day. And if there's 3 days in a row of high disease risk, then it will also recommend a spray. I want to talk about two field trials that were done in 2018 and then in 2019. They both had 8 treatments, and the treatments that were common among both years were unsprayed, weekly spray starting at the 2-leaf stage, Nasoxystrobin seed treatment with spray starting at the 2-leaf stage, a penflufen seed treatment with spray starting at the 2-leaf stage, and also BSPcast model, which we just looked at, and then TOMCAST model with a threshold of 15. And then in 2018, there was a weekly spray starting at the 4-leaf stage, and then also a Civitas drench at emergence. In 2019, what was different was there was an oxystrobin seed treatment with no foliar sprays, and additionally a penflufen seed coat with no foliar sprays. Assessments were done in 2 ways. First of all, weekly, with rating the 3 most mature leaves of 20 plants for each treatment. And then at the end of the growing season, 20 plants were destructively sampled and rated from 0 to 7, with 0 being no disease, as we can see here, and 7 being dead leaves. And then this data was incorporated into an equation to calculate disease severity. And these are the results from the field trial in 2018. The letters above the bars indicate statistical difference, If two treatments share a common letter, then they are considered to be not different from each other. So for this trial, we saw that the seed treatments, azoxystrobin and penflufen, with weekly sprays gave lower disease severity than the control. We also saw that the control was sprayed 0 times, and the treatments that started at the 2-leaf stage had 7 sprays. And additionally, when sprays were started at the 4-leaf stage, they had 5 sprays. The BSP and Tomcast model recommended 1 and 2 less sprays respectively than the weekly spray at the 2-leaf stage, but there was not a difference in disease severity. And these are the results for the field trial in 2019. As we can observe, first of all, that disease was lower in 2019 than in 2018. And we can see that penflufen as a seed treatment with foliar sprays was the only category that was different from the control. The control again had 0 sprays, along with the penflufen seed coat, which had no sprays, and the azoxystrobin seed coat, which had no sprays. And then the weekly spray starting at the 2-leaf stage had 7 sprays. And for this year, the BSB cast model recommended 5 sprays, where the Tomcast model recommended 6 sprays, but we can notice that disease pressure was low, so there should have been less recommended sprays. The conclusions from these years was that there was higher disease severity in 2018 than there was in 2019. There was no difference in yield for either year. We also noticed that penflufen is effective as a seed treatment with foliar sprays for both seasons. And forecasting models triggered too many sprays, especially in low disease years like we saw in 2019. So there's a need for an improved disease forecasting model. Now we'll jump ahead to last summer, 2021, looking first of all at the fungicide trial. There were 8 treatments, and they consisted of T77, which is trichoderma, which is a biological, Prevam, Miravis Duo, Circadis, Maravon, and then T77 alternated with Miravis Duo, and then T77 alternated with Circadis, and then a check. And it should be noted that there was 4 foliar sprays for this trial that started on June 30th and ended on July 28th. And ratings were done the same way as was explained earlier. And these are the results from the 2021 fungicide trial, again, looking at disease severity. There was moderate disease in 2021, and that was higher than 2020 and 2019. We can see that Miravis Duo was the most effective compared to the check. And we can see T77 was only different from the check when it was rotated with Miravis Duo, and not when it was on its own or when it was rotated with Circadis. But we can see that Maravon and Circadis were also better than the check, and Prevam was not different from the check. And these are the yield results for the 2021 trial. We can see Miravis Duo and also Miravis Duo alternate with T77 having the best yield. And then additionally, we see Prevam and T77 having the lowest in terms of yield, and were not different from the check. Now we'll move along to the 2021 disease forecasting trial. This trial had 6 treatments. They were the calendar, which could also be called weekly, BSB cast, which we've seen, Tomcast 15, which we've seen, and then Tomcast 25, so that had a larger threshold, and then a control without penflufen as a seed treatment, and then a control with penflufen as a seed treatment. And it should be noted that penflufen was applied as a seed treatment to all of these treatments except the control without a seed treatment. Dithane and Miravis Duo were alternated as fungicides for this trial. Dithane's active ingredient is mancozeb. It is registered for the control of botrytis leaf blight on onions, but is shown to be useful in rotation with Stemphylium leaf blight. The calendar and BSB cast model both recommended 6 sprays. The Tomcast with threshold 15 recommended 4 sprays, and the Tomcast with 25 recommended 3 sprays. And both controls received 0 spray applications. These are the results from the 2021 fungicide timing trial. All the treatments with penflufen have reduced disease severity compared to the control without a seed treatment with no foliar sprays. But we also saw no difference in disease suppression for the control with penflufen seed treatment compared to the rest of the treatments that received foliar fungicide sprays. So this shows even further a need for a better forecasting model. And additionally, there were no differences found in yield for this trial. And these are the conclusions for 2021. There was higher disease in 2021 compared to 2019 and 2020. We saw that the fungicide trial found Miravis Duo to be the most effective in disease suppression and yield. We also saw penflufen again being effective as a seed treatment along with foliar sprays. And additionally, forecasting models trigger too many sprays, and we need an improved disease forecasting model, especially to respond to low disease risk years. Now, I want to briefly talk about some of the current research that I'm working on, and I'm going to look at four different things right now. The first being comparing spore trapping methods. The second being looking at environmental studies controlling weather and spore concentration, looking at early fungicide resistance testing, and then overwintering of weeds. And these first two that I'm going to talk about have to do with improving disease forecasting. So first, looking at spore trapping to improve disease forecasting. Typically, we see spore concentrations increase around the middle to the end of August, which correlates with increased disease pressure through the month of August. But what I want to really understand is the connection between early season spore counts for predicting upcoming disease severity in that growing season. So I have some data just to show briefly. This is data taken from the Rotorod spore sampler from last season. We can see disease severity on the right side, which is what we've been looking at before in these graphs, and is represented by these orange dots. And we can see starting at the beginning of July, going through August, basically a linear trend of increase in disease severity. And then also on this graph, we can see spores per day that were caught by the Rotorod sampler. We can see at the beginning of the season, this arrow represents the first spore that was identified on June 14th. And we can see low amounts of spore concentrations throughout the month of July, but this is what I want to spend more time focusing on in my research. And we can see, as kind of predicted, towards the end of July and beginning of August, spore concentrations increasing until the end of August. And then to compare with one other spore trap, this is the Burkhardt 7-day volumetric spore trap. Again, this graph is very similar to the one I just showed with the disease severity values here. In this, we can see the first spore recorded on June 24th, so a little bit later, and we can see low amounts of disease, but then again, at the beginning of August, and then through the end of August, we can see increased spore concentrations. And the other part of an improved disease forecasting model, I want to look at controlled environmental studies. Specifically, I want to find the optimal and minimal leaf wetness duration at different temperatures for disease development. So really here, I want to find what the minimal temperature and the minimal leaf wetness duration is required for disease development. And this will help improve the disease forecasting model, especially in years and seasons where disease risk is relatively low. Next, I want to briefly talk about early season fungicide resistance testing. So I want to determine which fungicides are going to be effective for each growing season before spray applications start. So I'm working on developing a rapid method to test known genes of resistance in the pathogen in early season disease. These findings will be provided through the Muck station early in the growing season. So you can all stay tuned for that. And then finally, I want to talk about the role of weeds in overwintering. These weeds were sprayed with the pathogen last fall with the disease and were placed outside to overwinter. Again, as I was talking about before, we understand that weeds can be an alternative host during the growing season, but we're not sure exactly if they are overwintering hosts for this pathogen. So the weeds that I'm studying here are prickly lettuce, marsh cress, grass, and nutsedge, chickweed, lamb's quarter, sow thistle, and common groundsel. So this data will be analyzed in the next month or so, and hopefully we will see results this upcoming season. I'd like to acknowledge my advisors, Dr. Mary Ruth McDonald and Dr. Bruce Gosen, and additionally my committee members, Dr. Jen Foster and Dr. Cheryl Truman. And I'd like to thank the staff at the Ontario Crops Research Center, Bradford. And additionally, I'd like to acknowledge that this research project is funded in part by the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs through the Ontario Agri-Food Innovation Alliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for your presentation. I don't see any questions here in the chat, so we will keep moving. Next up, we have Tyler Blauel and Kevin Vander to talk about fungicide programs on downy mildew and Stemphylium leaf blight. Kevin, you are good to go.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. I saw there was one comment. So penflufen is Evergold Prime, just so everybody knows that. All right, yeah, so Tyler and I are going to have sort of a joint presentation looking at fungicide programs to control onion downy mildew and Stemphylium leaf blight. Michael gave a great overview of what we've done and what's been working and how we can move forward in terms of forecasting. And we're going to give an update of sort of how this would look in season. So again, just a brief reminder what Stemphylium looks like. We have the small lesions to start that are sort of oval shaped. The leaves start to die as the disease produces toxins, which cause the leaf to die back. And then we have the later symptoms. Again, you have these brown spots. You could get purple blotch to appear, and then the leaves will gradually die. And then we assess these leaves based on how much the leaf has died back to determine our disease incidence and then disease severity. Giving a brief background, as Michael said, Stemphylium vesicarium has a large host range, including onions and several weed species. This is just a brief overview of our severity in our trials that we've conducted over the past 11 years. You can see here the varying degrees of severity. So this is from our fungicide trial that we've conducted sort of for the past 11 years, looking at various fungicides and their efficacy on the disease. So you can see 2015, probably our worst year, we had almost 100% severity over our treatments. As Michael said, 2019 and 2020 were a little bit lower severity, and then up again last year in 2021. So looking at control strategies. So as you can see from Michael's data, everything should be treated with Evergold Prime. So if you're growing onions in Ontario, we would recommend that all the seed have Evergold Prime seed treatment. The penflufen is a group 7 fungicide, similar to all the fungicides that are registered for foliar control. But we've sort of proven from our research that the Evergold Prime does provide you with early season efficacy against Stemphylium. So then to start a fungicide program, we would recommend starting fungicides at the 3 to 4 leaf stage. So third, fourth week of June, that you would apply one application of fungicide at that time. The fungicides that we do have currently registered are still only partially effective. If you look at Pub 383, if you look at all the products recommended for Stemphylium, they all say suppression, none of them say control. So even the ones we have that are useful still don't give us very good control. Other things we can do to help control downy mildew or Stemphylium is to reduce damage from herbicides. Any wound that we create sort of in those first 3 or 4 leaves of growth potentially open up the plant for a site of infection. So gold damage, things like that, chateau damage. We've done research on if chateau increased the disease, which we proved it didn't. But every time you spray herbicides, the onion has to metabolize those and sort of fend it off. So the better weed control we can get and not injure the onions is all helpful. And then rotating between different products. We'll get to this in a minute, and it's maybe not as easy as just rotating between different products. So here are the current list of products registered for Stemphylium leaf blight in onions. So we have Quadris Top, Luna Tranquility, Circadus, Aprovia Top, Miravis Duo, and Maribon. And if you see here, the frat groups, so these are what make up the chemicals. We have a 11 and 3, 7 and 9, and then 4 7s and 3s and 11s. And what we've shown over the past is that the top two don't work. So basically you're left with 4 7s and a 3 and 11 in a combination. So we're spraying all the same frat group. The good thing, or maybe the slight good thing, is that there are subgroups in the frat group. So a 7 is not always the same. However, 2 of the 4 are in the same subgroup, so that doesn't give us very many options as well. So given this lack of rotation products and already resistance to different 7, 9, 3, and 11, how do we go about controlling Stemphylium in season? So these products, as Michael mentioned, aren't registered for Stemphylium, but also may be useful. So Manzate Dithane is relatively inexpensive as a contact, not a systemic herbicide. Bravo ZN is still available. We haven't tested these, but the biologicals may just give you a little bit of a break from the chemical fungicides. So they may offer some benefit in rotation to help reduce fungicide resistance. And they may be useful, these products that aren't registered may be useful when conditions aren't as favorable for disease. We'll hear a little bit later about what the status is of Bravo. It's okay maybe for 2022, but going forward, it might have a few more question marks. This is again, some of the data from our trial in 2021, where we had moderate disease. This is similar to the exact same trial that Michael showed. So we did have some good, significant control using Miravis Duo and Circadus compared to our T77. I didn't show the combination, which had better control, but we did have a little bit of a yield bump. So this is not usually seen where you have a level of disease that's not really great, but you still have some level of increased yield, which is a sign that the products are doing something. And these were sprayed 4 times, as Michael had said. So looking at risk factors, when should we be worried about what Stemphylium is going to have a bigger effect on our crops? So it loves warm weather. We've had warm weather in some of the seasons. So that warm weather and long periods of leaf wetness is what the disease likes to have to develop quickly. Rotating between group 7s, they are slightly different, but we still have limited options. What lowers the risk is cooler, dry weather, where we have sort of, low 20s and not a lot of humidity, lowers our risk. So there's not cultivar resistance, but there's cultivar differences. The early season, the transplant crops, those are our research that we've done. Those are more susceptible than some of our later storage onions in terms of how the disease affects them and which gets more disease. So your transplants and your early seeded onions are definitely more susceptible than some of the later storage varieties. So here, I just wanted to break down our timeline of how we would use the few fungicides that we do have. The graph here is broken down to risk on the left, the number of Canidia that we found on our traps, and then whether to spray a contact or a systemic fungicide, given the risk factors and what options are available. So as you can see, our prediction model said in early June, we had some risk already starting the first week of June. But as Michael said, we started finding the first spores on traps sort of the 13th, 14th of June. So this is when our risk starts to happen. and when we need to start thinking about applying that first product. Down on the bottom, as Michael showed, we started with mancozeb sort of later in June. So if this was 2022, what would we recommend? Since penflufen is a group 7 herbicide or fungicide, excuse me, we would recommend starting with a non-group 7. So as you remember from the previous slide, almost all the products we have contain a group 7. So we would start at a lower risk. We would start with a mancozeb application to give us some protection when we have these spores floating around, to give some protection to our crop, sort of starting the 20th, 25th of June, depending on the weather. And then after that, we would recommend going through when our risk increases here. We've had several days in a row of conditions which are conducive to disease development, no spores, but then we would start with our best product, sort of Miravis Duo, which would then give you about 10 to 12 days of control. And then we'd switch to a product like Circadus, or you could go to Miravon or Provia Top. And then here we've got Canidia all the time, but here we would stay with our systemic products when our risk is the highest. If risk was lower, you could maybe put a mancozeb in for 1 week. But all the systemic products, even though the risk values are here, if you have a systemic product, you'll have 10 to 12 days of coverage on each of those with each of those products. Looking in July, here we still have very high levels because the disease is starting to develop. So we're starting to catch many spores on traps that we need to stay on here. But you could, if disease did lower on a given year, you could go to a mancozeb in any of these alternative or to break up the group 7 products. I hope that makes sense to everybody. And that's the end of my presentation. So I'm going to end it here, and Tyler's going to take over from here on out.
Thanks, Kevin. Let me just pull this up here. Can you see that okay?
Yep, looks good.
So perfect, thank you. So thanks, Kevin. So when we're looking at onion downy mildew, I just wanted to start off by mentioning that there are a number of weather conditions that need to be met for the disease to actually develop. So in general, these are cooler temperatures, high humidity, and periods of long leaf wetness. So Downcast, which is a downy mildew predictive model, it takes into consideration these parameters and determines if each day is a high or low risk for downy mildew. So disease forecasting is important because it takes around 9 to 16 days from the time of infection, if spores are present, until you see these sporulating symptoms on your plants and leaves. So generally downy mildew, it looks like kind of a purplish fuzzy lesion development on the leaves. And the thing is, during this period of infection, you can't see it, and no symptoms occur until you start seeing this sporulation. But by this point in time, it's already too late for the plant to recover from this. So we want to be applying the correct fungicides at the correct time before infection takes place to really protect our onion crop. So in terms of risks for onion downy mildew, in general, as I kind of mentioned, it prefers cooler and humid temperatures, humid weather. It's especially when we have those periods of long morning dews or hazy or foggy mornings. Generally, we tend to see this in August, but last year we actually started seeing it in July as well. And when we do have this high risk, these periods of high risk, and we are finding spores, we want to be putting down a good fungicide to protect our onions from any disease development. And of all the fungicides that are registered for downy mildew, only a few of them are actually really effective to control the pathogen. And of the fungicides that are effective, we want to rotate them to prevent resistance and application timing of these products is essential. You want to get them on before any infection takes place. And high-risk days for onion downy mildew are generally when it's hot and dry. So that comes into consideration a little bit when we want to determine what we want to spray throughout the growing season. So just a little bit of history on onion downy mildew in the Holland Marsh. So for the past 10 years or so, in 2012 and 2019, using Downcast, it did not predict any sporulation infection periods or SIPs, which are the same as high-risk days. So it did not predict any high-risk days, and downy mildew did not occur and did not develop in any of our fields. So no fungicides were needed that year, those 2 years. However, in 6 of the 10 years, Downcast did predict high risk at points throughout the season. We were finding spores, and downy mildew did develop in the Holland Marsh. However, in a year like 2020, Downcast did predict high risk periods. We did find spores in our spore traps. However, we didn't find any downy mildew in any of the fields in the marsh. And this could be a result of putting down the correct fungicides at the proper time. So this is just a picture of what onion downy mildew can do to your field. It can be especially destructive when it comes early in the season. So there are a number of fungicides that are registered for protection of onion downy mildew. And as I mentioned before, not all of these are as effective as others. So if we look at this graph here, we can see products that are registered like Queva, Revis, and Reason. They don't really result in very good control of onion downy mildew, especially when you compare it to the untreated check. But when you look at products like Arondis, your Mancozeb, Zampro, Ridamil, rotated with Aliette, these products we found to be good products to control onion downy mildew. So in saying that, the products of all of them that are registered, the products that we would recommend for control are Arondis Ultra, Zampro, Ridamil Gold, Aliette in rotation with Ridamil Gold, and Manzate Pro Stick, or a Mancozeb product. So last year in our trial, when we look at some of those products like Ridamil in alteration with Arondis, Zampro, and Arondis on its own, even though it wasn't statistically significant, numerically you can see how many fewer lesions per plot there were of onion downy mildew compared to the untreated check. So these products work well, and these are the products that we recommend. So of all these products, 4 of them, Ridamil, Zampro, Arondis Ultra, and Aliette, these are systemic products. And as Kevin mentioned with the Stemphylium products, the downy mildew products that are systemic also provide around 10 to 12 days of protection. Your Manzate Pro Stick product, your Mancozeb, is also a good product when it's applied properly. And this is your contact fungicide. You can get around 7 days of protection with this product. However, that can vary on whether or not it rains. So in terms of our onion downy mildew fungicide timeline, this is a bit of an ideal spray program, similar to what Kevin went through just a little bit earlier. But basically, we started seeing some high risks for onion downy mildew in July and August last year. So all of this data that's up here is based off of last year's conditions. So this top row here, these are your downcast sporulation infection periods, or your high risk periods for onion downy mildew. Below that, these are our spores that we trapped on each day or each period. And then we have our fungicide applications and the time that they are effective. So we have our systemics and our contact Mancozeb. So just going through it a little bit, at the beginning of July, we started getting conditions that were conducive for onion downy mildew development. And we got a high risk or an SIP on the 1st of July. And conditions were looking somewhat conducive for continued development, but we weren't finding any spores at that period of time. So at this time, you might want to put down a Mancozeb product. And if you can get 7 days protection out of it, that's great. And then a little bit later, around the 9th of July, we got another high risk day. We still weren't seeing any spores, but if we look in the forecast, the weather forecast, and we could see that conditions may continue to be conducive for development, and there is the possibility of spores coming up, we might want to spray our best product. So we might want to spray, say, a Rondis Ultra, a systemic product, which will give us 10 days of protection during that period of time. And during that time that Rondis Ultra was on, we started collecting spores. So it's good that we got that product on in time, because again, we really want to get these products on before any downy mildew infection takes place. After that, we got another high risk day here on the 19th. Looking at the forecast, we may have had some days that are a little bit warmer and drier, which would have halted any development. We're catching a little fewer spores here. So we may want to go back and put down a Mancozeb product for this period of time. And hopefully we can get our 7 days protection out of it. And then we're looking around the end of July here. We had a high risk day on the 25th. We're starting to get a couple more spores here. And if conditions are continuing to look conducive, possibly, we might want to rotate over to one of our other better systemics. And in this case, let's say Zampro. So your Zampro can give you 10 days of protection again. It protects you during this whole period here where we had high risk and we're catching more spores. And then after that, we may want to rotate again to another one of our better systemics. So in this case, we'll say Ridamil Gold. So that can give you another 10 days of protection, which is great. And then this kind of puts you into the middle of August. So by this time, we're getting a couple more high risk days. We're catching more spores. But depending on where the crop stage is at, if you have transplants that have been in and they look like they're going to be lodging sometime soon, you may want to put down a Mancozeb product to protect you during that remainder of the season. However, if you have some seeded onions that are going to be standing for a little bit longer, you may choose to rotate back to one of our better systemics, Rondis Ultra, to give you kind of that prolonged period of protection. So in general, this is obviously an ideal spray program based on our weather conditions from last year. But the main point that we wanted to get across was that using our downcast forecasting model, when we have times of high risk or SIPs and we're catching spores, there is definitely the potential that these spores can start to infect our onion plants, and we really want to get a product on to prevent that and prevent any disease development. So that can help us choose which product we'd like to put on, whether it's a systemic or contact fungicide. And it's also important to note, and we also want to reiterate as well, your systemic fungicides, the ones that we have listed here, they do provide you with at least 10 days of coverage. And your Mancozeb contact fungicide can provide you with at least 7 days of protection, as long as it doesn't rain. So for really good control of onion downy mildew, it's important to apply your fungicides before any infection takes place. And the best way to do this is by using our downcast predictor model to understand whether each day is a high risk or low risk. And if we are getting high risk days, and especially if we are catching spores, we have 5 really good fungicides here that we would recommend spraying for control. Your Rondis Ultra, your Zampro, your Ridamil Gold, Aliette when it's in rotation with Ridamil, and your Manzate Pro Stick or Mancozeb. We also recommend putting in a surfactant for Rondis and Zampro. And the reason I just wanted to mention these fungicides once again is that there are many fungicides registered for control of onion downy mildew, but really these 5 products are the ones that provide proper control. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our funding partners, the Fresh Vegetable Growers of Ontario, the Bradford Co-op, the California Garlic, Onion and Research Advisory Board, and the Ontario Agri-Food Innovation Alliance. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Tyler, you do have a question here asking if Serifol was applied at the same timing as the other products.
I believe so. I believe
Yes,
it
all
was.
the products were applied of the same day. So I'd also just put in the chat, we'd like to have a discussion with people just to reiterate or have their understanding of how the programs that we've set out, if they make sense to people, or what I guess we heard back last year from people, because we said where there was risk of downy mildew, that people were spraying all the time. And what we'd like to get across is that our risk, because the risk was still there, if you applied fungicides, systemic fungicides, that just because we announced another risk period didn't mean that people needed to reapply fungicides. Because people were saying they sprayed 6 times and they didn't even have any downy mildew, and why did we have to do that? So we just like to open up the audience to have any discussion or any questions. If you feel free to put it in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question that way. We'd like to just engage people in sort of their understanding or how they felt last year went, or if there's ways that the program could be improved.
I just wanted to kind of mention that as well, Kevin. I know I put out those IPM programs twice a week, and I may be showing that there's a high risk for disease, whether it's Stemphylium or onion downy mildew, and I'm recommending products on there. But like Kevin said, if you have already applied a product, it does provide you for that period of protection. And it doesn't mean that you have to go out and spray every 3 or 4 days every time those IPM reports come out. So I just want to mention that again.
Yeah. So if there was also any suggestions on how we can improve that sort of communication between people, or if there's a way to relay the information more clearly to growers or to people, that we'd be open to suggestions of that as well. But I'm not sort of hearing anything or seeing anything, so we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but maybe we will move on from here then.
Okay, we will keep moving then. Thank you, Kevin and Tyler. Next up, we're going to have an industry update from Syngenta presented by Eric Phillips. Eric, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you, Jeff, and good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity here to join you this afternoon and speak to you a bit about Syngenta's portfolio and some of the changes that we have for the 2022 season. My name is Eric Phillips. I'm a horticultural specialist with Syngenta. You can see my contact information on the top of the screen here, and fortunate to be one of 2 horticultural specialists here in Ontario servicing the horticultural portfolio that we have. So along with my colleague Patricia Clofer, we provide agronomic, technical, and sales support for Syngenta's horticultural portfolio. So as I alluded to, right, today I was hoping to spend a couple of minutes talking to you briefly about some of the important label changes that our portfolio has seen over the last year, and I guess maybe share with you some of the additions that we've been made to our products that are in the marketplace today. Of course, we just had a couple of really good presentations on Stemphylium and the challenges that disease presents in onions, and as Kevin alluded to, Aprovia Top recently received a registration in onions, and I'll be speaking to that a bit later with regards to what we can expect and see from Aprovia Top and the value that product's going to bring. Yesterday, when we heard Tyler speak about his IPM project, right, we saw the importance and the challenges around thrips, and happy to report that Manecto Pro is a new technical tool for thrips and leaf miners in bulb vegetables. And again, I'll spend a couple minutes here shortly talking to you about the benefits of Manecto Pro. Miravis Duo, a relatively new product, maybe in the market now for 2 or 3 years, broad label across several different vegetable crops. And pleased that it continues to expand in terms of the labeled uses. The one that I want to call it specifically, of course, is the suppression of Cercospora now in carrots. And then the last important label change for the 2022 season is, of course, the removal of lettuce from our Ridamil Gold MZ label. This is a result of the Mancozeb evaluation, and unfortunately, those regulations come into effect in 2022, and our label has had to be amended as a result of that. So before we get into some of those new products that I spoke of or introduced here just recently, I thought we'd just cover off a couple of the different spray programs that we have and the tools that you might choose to use from Syngenta's portfolio. And so on the screen here in front of you, you have a list of different insect, fungicide, and weed control products available to you in carrots. Again, focusing on the fungicide specifically here, starting off the season with Quadris Top, making sure that you're off to a good start and are successful, specifically managing for Alternaria and Cercospora. Then subsequently, later applications with Blauel, Miravis Duo, of course, very effective and broad product, and in addition to Alternaria, white mold, and powdery mildew, of course, the addition of Cercospora now to that label, and then finishing off that season managing for white mold with Allegro and using the standard for that in your carrot crop. Similarly, in onions, again, a couple of different products here. I will speak to Manecto Pro shortly. You see Aprovia Top as well. And I'm not going to speak to what was just reviewed on the fungicide space specifically with Downy Mildew. Tyler just did a great job of summarizing the different tools that are available and most effective. And you can see a couple of those here on the screen. But of course, top of mind is that Stemphylium piece, right? And go back to Tyler's presentation yesterday with the incidence and severity of Stemphylium, particularly in the marsh this past year, was very high. And while it is going on, almost 15 years of since the initial discovery of Stemphylium in the marsh, it's one of those diseases that we continue to learn more and more about and continue to discover how best to manage it. And I think, as Kevin alluded to earlier, fundamentally changing when we think about needing to make an application for Stemphylium is critical. And we would agree that the application needs to be earlier, as early as that 3-leaf stage, and also using your best products earlier in the season as well. And so, a couple of different options, not so much in terms of flexibility, given that they're largely group 7 based, but again, there is some nuances between the different group 7s in terms of their subcategories. The recommendation with either Aprovia Top or Miravis Duo would be to consider inalteration or followed by applications of a contact or a group M fungicide such as Mancozeb that was alluded to earlier, and even consider mixing those in the tank with these particular products. Later on in the season, of course, historically, what about the other diseases, right? Botrytis or purple blotch, and historically, when we've been applying group 7s, those haven't been a problem. But again, if we're thinking about using those products earlier in our spray program now, what does that mean for late July and August? And so it's important to consider other potential solutions like Blauel and Quadris top later on in the season, so that those particular diseases don't become a problem for you later on in the year. So I want to get into one of the new products, Aprovia Top, as Kevin alluded to, recently registered, and so it's a combination of two active ingredients, a group 7 and a group 3, so solatinol and difenoconazole, and together they provide translaminar activity. So here we are getting protection on both sides of the leaf as the molecules get applied on one side and move through the tissue onto the other side. And also, as this combination provides two modes of action and multiple modes of effective action on some target diseases, Stemphylium included. And so, despite the amount of options that we have, by mixing these two molecules, we're trying to delay the development of resistance and ensuring that the tools that we have can last as long as they can. Looking at the label information at a glance here, of course, Aprovia Top is not a new product, so it has been registered for several years and has uses in several other vegetable crops. But if we focus our attention on the far right of the screen here, specifically in bulb and green onions, so the subgroups that you see are listed there, Aprovia Top has and is registered with activity on purple blotch, garlic rust, and Stemphylium. It's a convenient single-use rate in onions specifically, which allows Aprovia Top to be applied at 10 acres per jug. And then you see some of the convenient pre-harvest and re-entry intervals that are relevant to you here, specifically for Aprovia Top. Moving on to the second new product that I wanted to speak to, and that was Minecto Pro. So Minecto Pro is a combination of two active ingredients, again, abamectin, a group 6, and cyantraniliprole, a group 28. And here you're getting two different modes of action with exceptional control on some hard to control insects and pests, and in the case of bulb vegetables, thrips specifically. So these are complementary active ingredients that improve the efficacy or broaden the spectrum depending on the target and the particular crop that you're dealing with. They do provide both contact and systemic activity. And in the case of onions specifically, an alternate mode of action, right? We don't see a lot of group 6 use in onions today. And by the introduction of abamectin with the mix in cyantraniliprole, you're getting an alternate mode of action and two active ingredients working together. In terms of consideration on where to apply and how best to use these two molecules in combination, it's really targeting that second generation of thrips. Recognizing that what you're using today is for your first generation of thrips is not something that we're trying to displace here with Minecto Pro. The tools that you have available and are using widely today for your first generation, we would encourage you to continue to do that. Where Minecto Pro best fits and should be considered is that second generation. And these guidelines come out of Cornell, and of course some of the observations and trial use that we've done subsequently in the marsh over the last couple of years. Again, not a new product in Canada, but the expanded use here in bulb vegetables, right? So Minecto Pro has some existing vegetable uses already, and those are on the screen. But if you see on the right-hand side, again, bulb vegetables, in this case, the entire crop group is now registered with Minecto Pro, and the targets being thrips and leaf miners. Single use rate, again, in this case for thrips, and then the re-entry interval and PHI information is available to you. We do recommend that Minecto Pro be applied with methylated seed oil surfactant, and that's to improve the coverage and efficacy of the product, specifically when we're talking about one of those tricky insects and pests with thrips specifically. So I think I'm coming up on time here, so I'll conclude with, again, my contact information on the far right of the screen. And bring and highlight some of the support tools that at Syngenta that we provide and have heard provide very good value to yourselves as growers, and that's our quick reference guides. Specifically for horticultural this year, we have 12 quick reference guides. You see them listed on the screen here in front of you, and I've tried to pull out an example of the carrots specifically. So our quick reference guides provide label information, important parameters and comments around how best to use the products themselves, any specific recommendations of all our products summarized on one sheet, and then subsequently where that particular product might fit in your spray program. Both hard copy and electronic copies are available, and I would encourage you to either contact myself or your preferred retailer to get a copy as we head into the season this year. So with that, I want to again thank you for the opportunity here and the time with you this afternoon. I wish you all the best this upcoming season, and with that, I turn it back over to you, Jeff. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Eric, for the update. And you've left your contact info and quick references if people do think of anything, so that's great. Next up, we have an update on bacterial disease and research and the Stop the Rot project presented by Brenna Aegerter from the University of California. Brenna, if you're good to go, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. I'm Brenna Aegerter. I work for the University of California Cooperative Extension System. I'm based in Stockton, and I'm working with a large team of US researchers on bacterial bulb rot. And we have funding from USDA for this 4-year project. And so that's going to kind of talk to you about what we're doing. I want to sort of make a disclaimer that I'm not familiar with your production area. So, I guess take everything with a critical eye to whether it applies to your production system. But I was interested to see that you're farming on muck soils, because this is, let me get my laser pointer here. This is the city on the edge here where I live, and this is the major area for vegetables and row crops near me, and it's reclaimed wetlands. And this is not an onion trial, this is my asparagus trial, but we do have peat and muck soils, so some similarity there at least. Okay, so bacterial bulb rots of onion. This is a list of all the known bacterial pathogens of onion. This list was taken from the Compendium of Onion and Garlic Diseases, 2nd edition. But actually, our project has recently identified some additional bacteria that can rot onions. But this is, these are the main ones here, and I in red highlighting the more common ones. So Burkholderia, Enterobacter, Pantoia, and Pectibacterium. But there can be other ones as well. So partly because there are so many different possible bacteria that can cause this, it can be difficult to diagnose. So it's a challenge for diagnostic labs, these bulb rots. One of the things our project is working on is detection methods, but I'm not going to go too far into that. But let's just say that it's diagnostically challenging. We don't have resistant onion cultivars, and it has been a challenging disease for breeders to select, for resistance to this disease. Bactericides have not proven to be highly effective. And I'll touch on that. And so here in the US, it's estimated that the bacterial diseases of onion result in losses of $60 million a year. And bulb rots are particularly a problem for onions that are stored. Even though the infections start in the field, that bulb rot progresses during storage. And obviously this has a major economic impact. As I'm sure you know, all your costs are already incurred, including harvest and storage costs. So it's really heartbreaking when there's bulb rot that progresses in storage. All right, so this is, we have a large research team. We've got 24 collaborators over 12 states, as well as a colleague that's at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And we're led by Lindsay Dutoit, plant pathologist with Washington State University in Mount Vernon, Washington. We also have a 14-member stakeholder advisory panel, which is seed company breeders and plant pathologists, onion growers and consultants that is helping us out, make sure we're, keeping everything, reasonable and grower oriented. And this is just a kind of overview of the objectives. It's a very large project with lots of objectives, and I'm not going to go into all of it. But what I would like to focus on today is the objective B, the bacterial disease management. And I should have mentioned this earlier, but our project website is hosted by AlliumNet. So you can just go to alliumnet.com and you'll find the Stop the Rot pages there. And then there are several articles in Onion World that I'll be mentioning through the course of this talk that are refer to the project. So if you want to look for those for more information. Okay, so the disease management objectives. We're looking to identify onion production practices as well as environmental factors and bacterial inoculum sources that can impact the disease, and try to put this knowledge into towards developing some practical solutions for growers. Going into the project, we already knew from previous research as well as anecdotal evidence that there are a number of factors that impact bacterial diseases in onion. So here's the list. We don't cover all of these in our project, but we're focused on the irrigation, fertility. We are doing some risk. We do have a group that's working on risk modeling. So that could be any factor actually for that risk modeling. And then we're looking at cultural practices. And we know that thrips can be a risk factor, damage from thrips, but we're not particularly looking at thrips. Okay, so jumping in here, objective B1 is looking at the impacts of irrigation on bacterial diseases. So here in California, we have trials comparing drip versus sprinkler irrigation. They have also similar comparisons in Georgia. And then in Washington and Oregon, they're looking at irrigation frequency as well as the timing of the final irrigation, and in addition to looking at drip as well compared with sprinklers. I'm not going to go, I don't have time to go into all the trials, but I'm going to focus on the trial in California. But I did want to mention that in the 2020 Washington trial, where they were looking at the timing of the final irrigation, if they halted irrigation at 5 to 10% tops down, they maintained marketable yield and reduced the bulb rot by 16 to 23% compared to ending that irrigation 1 or 2 weeks later. Okay, so this was our recent last season's trial in Tule Lake. So for those of you that aren't familiar, Tule Lake is up in the very northern part of California on the border with Oregon, and also does have high organic matter soils, similar to my area. So we were looking, just wanted to compare sprinkler and drip irrigation side by side. So the whole trial was started with sprinklers up to the 5-leaf stage. And then at that point, the treatments were implemented. And then the treatments got the same irrigation frequency and the same water application rates. So the only difference was how the water was delivered. So that we used a fresh market onion variety, even though this is primarily, well, there's both dehydration onions and fresh market onions grown in this area, but the fresh market onions do seem to be more susceptible to the disease. So we used that. And we had naturally occurring disease in the field, but we also inoculated in August. So we put Burkholderia and Pectobacterium to inoculum, a mixture of the two bacteria. And then we were looking at the foliar symptoms weekly, and then the bulb symptoms at harvest. All right, here's so Rob Wilson is the researcher up there in Tule Lake, and he's got some nice drone footage of the trial. So you can see the drip irrigation plots on the left here, fairly nice stand, and then ignore this border area here. It was not irrigated fully, but if you look here, the sprinkler irrigations, you can see that there's some issues there, and it was those foliar symptoms were due to bacterial disease. And at harvest, there was indeed plenty of rot. Because there was already disease prior to the inoculation, our inoculation treatment didn't increase the severity of rot. It was already pretty high. Okay, so if we look at yield here, and I apologize if I didn't convert my units, so hopefully these numbers make sense to you. But anyway, if nothing else, you can look at the differences here. So drip irrigation increased total yield by 22%, increased bulb size by 17% compared to sprinklers, and reduced the bulb rot incidence greatly from 22% down to under 1%. So pretty dramatic differences. And these, this was right at harvest, so this didn't involve any storage. Okay, in Georgia, they were also comparing drip and sprinklers, and they have 2 years of trials. And so in red, you can see where they saw significant differences. So in the first year, the drip did reduce disease. In the second year, there wasn't a significant difference in disease. And then there was, the drip was slightly, there was less jumbos. There were fewer jumbos in the drip irrigation, and so they saw an impact on yield. So that the drip didn't look good in their system. So we know that irrigation or rainfall, for that matter, in excess of crop needs does seem to promote bacterial rot. On the other hand, we also know that onions are pretty sensitive to water stress. So you kind of have to balance, the potential reductions in bulb size or yield from irrigation reductions against, the risk of bulb rot. So, to help with that decision-making process, soil moisture sensors can be really useful to help you reassure you that you're providing sufficient water for the crop while, avoiding any excess. All right, so there are a number of nitrogen fertility trials that are going on. The majority of these have not shown impacts on bulb rot. So prior to this project, there was a lot of published, several published studies, some of them showing that excess nitrogen increases bulb rot and other studies showing no effect. We do know that, it is known that excess nitrogen can make increase the neck size, right? So larger neck size means slower drying during curing, and that we know that curing time is a time when the onion plants are very susceptible to infection. All right, moving on to the bactericide trials. We've had 7 field trials in 2020, and then most of those were also repeated in 2021. Looking at a long list of materials, primarily copper-based materials, but also, you can see there's a number of other products here. And so we're making applications on a 7 to 10 day application interval, depending on the trial. Trials got anywhere between 4 and 6 applications, depending on the location. And then we're looking at, again, that foliar disease as well as the bulb rot. And, basically, the only state that has gotten significant results is Georgia, where they have seen a reduction in bulb rot from all the treatments, actually, from the copper products and the oxidate and other products. In the other trials, there was no significant difference from the weekly applications. So kind of mixed results there. And, that may have to do with the fact that Georgia has a very humid climate. We're also interested in looking at copper resistance, whether copper resistance is something that is widespread or if it varies by region. So that is a possibility that we're looking into. Okay, moving on to cultural practices. So these are trials that were conducted in Washington and Georgia, not in my region, but they are looking at whether rolling the onion tops, and this is how photo shows how they did it in small plots, and then undercutting, and then also the timing of topping, how that impacted bulb rot. And in Georgia, similar trials, but they are looking at hand harvest versus mechanical harvest and different harvesters. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time on these because basically most of these Washington trials had no effect. So here's rolling tops, and the difference here is between inoculated and non-inoculated. So that just shows that, their inoculation method increased the disease, right? Spraying bacteria on the onions increased disease. That's not really, relevant to management, right? So what we're looking at here is there any difference in disease between the yellow, which is the control, and the striped, which is the rolling tops? So no statistically significant effect of rolling. And then in 2021, they did that. They moved it up to doing it earlier, rolling earlier, but they have results pending from 2021. This trial's undercutting, again, no significant effects of undercutting. And then this is the timing of topping. So this is the yield, no difference there. This is the bulb rot in the fall, and then this is the graph on the right is after storage, but no significant difference, no impact of the timing of topping on whether it was early, normal, or late topping didn't significantly impact the disease. In Georgia, so this is comparing the digging methods, so using a chain digger versus a slate blade undercutter. And you can see here that bacterial rot developed on bulbs that were harvested with a straight blade undercutter. So higher here and here, and then also here. And then looking at hand harvest or manual harvest compared with mechanical harvest, there was actually more bulbs that were diseased with the hand harvest. And so one of the things they're going to look at is whether when you're clipping the roots and then clipping the top, whether you might be actually introducing the bacteria into the neck with the shears, you know, because you're basically getting soil on them, right, when you clip the roots. So that's something that they're going to look into further in Georgia this season. And then they looked at the topping, the length of the topping. So comparing 1 inches with 3 and 5 inches. And bulbs topped to a neck length of 1 inch had about 5 times more bacterial rot than bulbs that were clipped to either 3 or 5. So that's pretty interesting. But again, you know, this is in Georgia, very humid climate. So, you know, this may or may not be relevant to your system. All right. And then the last thing I'm going to share is about post-harvest sanitation. So the interest here was to evaluate commercial storage treatments. There are companies that will provide this service. They bring their treatment trailer to your storage area and apply these treatments. And we looked at, well, this is, I shouldn't say we, they in Washington looked at this as well as in Colorado. So there were some different thermofogged treatments. Those were jet egg, Sanidate, and Storox, and then an ozone. So they had an ozone generator that produced ozone and piped it into the treatment. So for this research, they did it with a storage container. So created sort of a mini onion storage thing and piped it in there. And then they evaluate, it's just a single treatment at the beginning of storage, and then they were evaluating the rot at the end of storage in February. All right, this is the results from 2020. We don't have the 2021 results yet ready to present, but basically, again, you know, if you inoculate, you get more rot, but they did have some naturally occurring rot. But here, there's no difference, no difference between the non-treated control and these different treatments that were applied. So don't need to do these for, at least for bacterial diseases. You don't need to do storage treatments. So to get a little bit more nuanced about it, this past season, one of the things they did was took cheesecloth, put the bacteria on the cheesecloth, and then put that on top of these bags of onions that were going into this treatment chamber. And what they found is that you can see the ozone did not kill the bacteria, but the oxidate, Storox, and jet egg thermofog treatments did kill the bacteria on the cheesecloth. So that's pretty interesting. So, and it makes sense, you know, if it's something that's on the outside of the bulbs that's exposed, you know, whether that's fungal spores or bacterial cells that are on the outside of the onion bulbs, these treatments, you know, can have some efficacy, but they're not going to, you know, control internal infections because it's just the bacteria are protected inside there, right? So, you know, there may be some utility, probably more so for fungi, you know, that Aspergillus or other fungi that might be a problem in storage. All right, with that, I'd like to acknowledge our funding from USDA. And this, again, you know, most of the results I was presenting are from other states. So we have a whole team there that was doing that work. And I'm just, you know, presenting on their behalf. And I want to thank our stakeholder advisory panel. And then there's the link again for the project website if you want to check that out. And if there's time, I'm happy to try to answer any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you very much, Brenna, for your presentation. I don't see any questions in the chat, so we will keep on moving. Next up, we're going to have an OFVGA policy update presented by Chris Duyvelshoff, Gordon Stock, and Stefan Larrass. Chris, you are good to go.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jeff, and appreciate the opportunity for the Ontario Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association to give an update at this year's Muck Crops Conference. So this presentation is actually going to be a 3-for-1 here, and we're going to be covering several different topics that OFVGA works on. And so I have a couple of my colleagues joining me here today, Stefan Larrass and Gordon Stock. And so Stefan Larrass is going to be the leadoff speaker today, talking about safety nets. So Stefan, whenever you're ready, if you want to come on, I'll be running the slides. Just let me know when you want me to change them.
Sounds good. Thanks, Chris. Morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get into it. The general angle of our updates, I think, is going to be mostly kind of a year in review, to some extent, high-level policy stuff. So quite a contrast from that technical production level presentation we just had. So real high level on safety nets for growers here. I assume most of the deadlines for enrollment are May 16th for folks that are in attendance today. Again, OMAPRA has extended its extra COVID-related coverage for labor peril. So I think uptake for the muck crops is fairly high on crop insurance, and if you haven't considered it, it's certainly this might be the last year that we have this extra coverage, COVID related. So hopefully folks take advantage. On ag stab, I think again the uptake of ag stab in among growers here is probably decent. I'm guessing around 50% or so. The program has changed quite a bit. The change of the reference margin limit, if you haven't discussed it with your accountant, might be worth doing it. I don't have specific numbers for muck crops, but generally field-based crops, the reference margin limit on average has an impact somewhere around 25 to 50% for field-based crops in terms of raising the average payment. So again, worth a conversation to have with the accountant. SDRM, a very high uptake for across all crops in our sector, assuming folks here too. We're working on keeping the program supported politically, and our focus in terms of BRM programs, our focus is on that program, making it stronger, getting it funded to the extent that folks are feeling extra costs, extra exposure to some of those supply chain risks. And that's kind of our message to government, is that if you're going to put more support to the sector, SDRM is very well understood, very well used, and to use that going forward. Chris, let's go to the next slide. Labor, I don't want to get into it. I think I just wanted to acknowledge that OFVGA is hearing a lot of issues when they come up, and we do relay them to the appropriate level of government, the Ministry of Health, for example, or we'll work with our national counterpart to raise things that ESTC or Service Canada. We do hear issues, and it doesn't seem to end. The latest issue that we've heard is that workers that are getting off the plane, the foreign workers, you have local law enforcement checking up on their quarantine status, if they're complying with quarantine. And in many cases, like for all fully vaccinated workers, they don't need to quarantine. So you've got that disconnect that's still happening, that some enforcement staff don't understand what they're enforcing. And so we're trying to resolve those issues, and Gordon and I do welcome any one-off issues that folks are experiencing, and hopefully you're getting Gordon's updates. He'll be speaking later, and have his email address handy. Federal rules, I mentioned that if your workers are fully vaccinated, you shouldn't be dealing with quarantine anymore. The Misfit program, it's expired. Applications are not open, but we understand that quite a few growers are still waiting for their program payment. We have worked with farms to escalate some of these kind of pending payments, and hopefully folks will see movement on their files. Next slide. lots of consultations. I won't get into it, but man, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about, making the program, whatever you want to call it, empowering the worker more, and putting more safeguards around workers. There's housing consultations. I'll just say this: there's a lot of plans by the federal government to add oversight, to add regulations. It's in some cases it's terrifying. In some cases, it's good that we are getting some sense now, more or less, from the federal government, that they're aiming for end of this year, end of 2022, to have some new clarity on what the housing rules will be federally. So I think a lot of people have sort of been in limbo and asking us, what kind of decisions should I be making? What should I factor in if I'm making changes or to my bunkhouse or making new builds? And honestly, we've been saying, it's there you go, Gordon, thanks. Yeah, at this point, all we have is the Ontario guidance, and that's obviously posted on the farm's website from the feds. We'll just have to wait, and it's really tough. We relayed that to the feds, and obviously we're asking for clarity sooner than later. There's consultations on provincial factors as well, but I won't get into those right now. We do updates through OFVGA on those consultations. Next slide. Chris? Just a quick update. Our industry, and I think folks that are here are through OFVGA do support these kind of activities where you get outside groups that challenge some of those agricultural legislations. I think it's easy to take for granted that we have these agricultural rules that reflect agricultural kind of the seasonality, the perishability of what we grow. And there's outside groups that just don't want to hear it. They want industrial type regulations and laws for our sector. So this is an example. And folks, I mean, the benefit of having you here is just to make sure that you understand that this is happening behind the scenes. You get these court cases where if they ended badly, it could erase some of the regulations that we have in place that protect kind of that farming context that we have. So this one it's a good news story. The coalition of farm groups that we're part of as OFVGA, it's called LICC. We won a multi-year court case against a group that was trying to challenge the Agricultural Employee Protection Act, and they were basically looking for kind of industrial style strike and lockout regulations for farms when there's kind of a labor dispute between you and your workers. So a good news story from that perspective. So we appreciate growers' support for this this effort. Next slide. Just real quick, I think, Chris, we can kind of move through these slides. What I wanted to convey here is that we are keenly aware, actually stay on this slide just so folks see, we're keenly aware that we're always fighting an uphill battle about public perception of the migrant worker programs like SOP, like AgStream, and bad public perception makes it really hard to continue the program and use the program. So just wanted to give folks a few screenshots of what we're doing. That I think what's exciting about this initiative that's being led by OFVGA, but we're working with other groups like Farm and Food Care. I want to give a shout out to Kelly Daynard, who's done amazing work here. Basically what this does is it explains, thanks Gordon, yeah, this is the website where everything is based. What we've done in the past, we've done a good job at kind of telling the public and kind of decision makers that like in government about all the rules and regulations, all the red tape that's there to keep workers safe. What we haven't done as much is, and we have done it some, but this is really, really new in terms of the effort that's going into this, is telling the perspective from the worker side. And so all these faces that you see have an interview, have a story that go along with it. They go out through Instagram, through Twitter, through Facebook. We're using media as well, like the National Post and Toronto Star and Chatelaine. This is really geared at urban audiences that don't have an appreciation for what this program means to the workers. And I think that was kind of a missing thing that we really noticed over the past few years is people kept saying, oh yeah, you're defending the program. Of course you would, because you benefit from it. This is the part of what the workers think of it. And so you see here, Felina, of the square of 4 pictures, Felina as a worker. And so and then there's me at the bottom right, on top left, oh, I'm blanking right now. I shouldn't, but grower that joined, Amanda. Yeah, again, it's that whole, everyone's got a perspective, but the key one here is the worker's perspective. Here's an example of the stories that are going out. So getting lots of uptake, and I think we're resonating. I think Gordon is also able to send these stories to kind of political offices, which is really key. So we track the performance. Folks are spending time on these stories, which is really important. They're not just clicking through. You see here almost 4 minutes per reader. And the age groups that are being reached by this campaign are great. These are kind of the tech savvy age groups. You've got the 25 to 35 and 35 to 44 age groups, and lots of uptake in those groups that will be kind of the next generation of people with opinions, and lots of good feedback on our social websites. So, and people really appreciate hearing from the worker's perspective. So you see a lot of like, thank you to the worker. And it's not about the farm, it's about the worker. They're thanking the workers for the work they do to grow the crops. Next slide. What's ahead? We're going to continue this. I think we're really onto something. We're getting good feedback. People are seeing the value of it. So we're going to continue doing the social media, National Post, Metro Land, so that's Toronto Star, and keep making sure that Google finds us, and people that are searching this kind of migrant worker story theme, that they find us. Next slide. Just a shout out to the folks involved. Again, Kelly Daner is amazing. Oh, Lillian Shear, absolutely amazing writer, and fantastic to work with. Next slide. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Stefan. Really interesting work there with the migrant workers. I just wanted to give a couple of updates on the crop protection file, relevant particularly to muck crops here. A couple of different products that have gotten some attention recently. So first off, starting on chlorothalonil fungicide, Bravo and Echo brands. These are registered for all 3 of the main muck crops in carrots, celery, and onion. And chlorothalonil went through an extensive reevaluation about 4 years ago. And at that point, we thought that all was good and the product would be registered for the next 15 years. However, we were surprised when a couple of months ago, PMRA announced a special review decision canceling all food uses of chlorothalonil. And so this review was triggered by a previous decision out of the European Union to cancel all uses of chlorothalonil. And up until this point, PMRA has then been required to start a special review as part of that. In this particular review, the aspects of concern that PMRA is looking at is chlorothalonil residues and the breakdown products of chlorothalonil in water for drinking, and exposure to aquatic organisms in water. Importantly, just highlighting here that all of this data that is used in the risk assessment for the water is coming from computer modeling. And so that's basically running models, mathematical models, to estimate what the concentrations might be in water. And these are inherently conservative and tend to overestimate values. And so it's very important that we can find some real world information to help replace this computer modeling. So Syngenta is leading the science response on this, and they've been looking across the globe at other areas with some good data for chlorothalonil in water to help replace these computer models. And in that case, that should lead to some more realistic scenarios. And this is something that seems to be repeating itself again and again. The Mankazeb evaluation had the same problem, where we were relying on these computer models that provide very high values and overestimate risk. So the typical use patterns, such as the number of applications, rate, and timing for muck crops, have been developed for Ontario. And ourselves, Ontario Fruit and Vegetable Growers, as well as the Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada, which was formerly known as the CHC, are organizing an industry response. And we also have regular calls with Syngenta. So to be determined on the future of chlorothalonil. The other one I wanted to highlight here is chlorpyrifos. So that would be Lorsban, Pyrifos, Warhawk, and Pyrenex. So this is an older decision as far as Canada goes, with the reevaluation decision being issued in December of 2020, which canceled all uses under a phase-out timeline. So in Canada, chlorpyrifos is currently under a phase-out. However, it remains legal to use with the previously approved labels until December 10th, 2023. So if you still have chlorpyrifos, it is still legal to use in Canada. And our MRLs remain unchanged from where they were before the reevaluation. So the residue levels that were acceptable before are still acceptable as far as Canada is concerned. However, there has been a recent change in the United States, and chlorpyrifos MRLs were canceled, all of them, by the EPA as of February 28th, 2022. So this February. So going forward, chlorpyrifos residues are not acceptable in the US market, applying this year and beyond. And so it's recommended that you avoid using any chlorpyrifos on crops to be exported to the US to avoid any issues with MRLs. And that's the end of the crop protection update. And I will now pass this on to my colleague, Gordon Stock, to talk about environment.
Thanks, Chris. And just noting the time, I will I'll move through just a couple slides here. I'll go through them fairly quickly. But just on the environment side, number of I think if you'll be following, the fair bit of talk on climate change reduction or carbon reduction that both federally and provincially that we're going to have to be working through very soon. Even the federal government more recently has put out fertilizer reduction plans. So we're following these issues very closely and we'll be responding accordingly. Certainly at the OFVGA level, I think one thing that'll be really important to help us respond is to ensure we have strong engagement from the various regional and commodity groups around the province. So in your case, the Holland Marsh Growers Association will be looking for support and input from there. I mean, and then just in addition to sort of environment specific items, in terms of more regulation, one sort of proactive thing that they are working on, the province is working on, is a climate change impact assessment. So they're planning for how do we, as a province or as an industry, prepare for what's anticipated to be the climate change impacts in terms of water availability, temperature, increasingly variable weather patterns, etc. I think the slides there, but we'll carry on to the next one, Chris. I think that's fine. And then moving forward, Stefan did a pretty good overview of what's been going on over the last sort of year and some things that have occurred. Moving forward, we're certainly focusing on the Ontario election that's intended for June 2nd. With that, there'll be our sort of key asks would be probably more related to the first two bullets, but everything we're working towards is related to protecting and promoting that domestic food production. And given all of the world events these days, whether it be the pandemic or the events in Europe, having and ensuring we've got a strong production in Ontario and Canada is becoming even more important, and we need to make sure that government understands that, and government is sort of setting up an environment that allows the industry to be successful. And just quickly here, with respect to SDRM, that program is a pot of funds within the RMP program, the risk management program the province has, and we're working with the other commodity groups in the livestock and grain sectors to encourage the province to increase that by another $100 million to get it to a total of 250. Access to labor, I mean, that one's an obvious one, but certainly trying to promoting a predictable minimum wage, ensure that, agencies like health units are, that their decision-making is considering the impacts to food production and the need for labor and continuity of labor. I touched on a bit of climate change and environment issues before, but I think the key there is that we're not regulating the industry to the point where our farmers can't be competitive, and that there's adequate support there from the province or the feds to be able to innovate and reduce our any problematic environmental impacts. Chris touched on crop protection. That's mostly a federal issue, but certainly it does help to have a strong advocacy from the province to the feds to ensure that there's adequate funding for things like the Pest Management Center, which is looking at supporting new registrations of products. And then the retail code of practice, which has been a bit more of a topic in the last year and a half, and that one certainly, again, that's more of a federal issue at this point, but at some point there will likely be aspects of it that need to be implemented provincially once we get to that point, although realistically that could be some time down the road, but we certainly need to have the province's support as we move forward. And with that, I'll stop because I know we're a few minutes over time. Certainly welcome to take any questions, but I don't want to take us over time. Our email addresses are in the chat box. You're welcome to contact any one of us. We enjoy hearing from growers and happy to assist where we can.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me speak today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Josh Mosiondz. I took over from Jim Chappett as Ontario's Provincial Minor Use Coordinator fully back at the end of June or early July last year. And I also had a slight appearance last year at the Muck conference here as my first public appearance with Jim, but I guess I'll continue with a full update this year. So what I'm going to touch upon today and some of the recent minor use activities even is included here. First one, it will be a slide on the 2021 minor use year. I'll talk about the 2022 minor use workshop. There's been an abnormally high demand for emergency use registrations over the last probably 6 months or so. From fall 2021 to present, we've had CAP 1080 that's been registered for field pepper for anthracnose, Palladium on greenhouse strawberries for powdery mildew. Tough 600, as mentioned yesterday, was submitted early last week for use on carrots or broadleaf weeds. I'll touch on this in a later slide again. We are currently working on an emergency use for Allegro for use on strawberries for Neopestulopsis. And there's also another one in progress for the use of fullback on hops for Diaporthy leaf blight. It's also in progress, but being led by Quebec, but Ontario will also be participating in this. Chris did a really good job touching on chlorothalonil earlier, but I will touch on that with a brief slide. There's been policy development with PMRA, including a new working group that OMAFRA has been leading with regards to vertical farming. This started out as an inquiry last fall as to whether or not vertical farmers could use existing greenhouse product registrations. Turns out they couldn't, and a new policy needs to be developed. So we imagine this is going to turn something into like what was done a few years ago with the hoop houses policy that was developed. And it's now a small national working group, but we're hoping to have policy developed within the next year or so we can begin some minor use registrations. There's also discussions going on with PMRA regarding the funding announcement last August. There's about $42 million announced. This includes a national water monitoring strategy where PMRA is looking to develop a new harmonized process across Canada to monitor pesticide residues as well as metabolites. They're also looking at the reopening of the Pest Control Products Act and strengthening some of the terminology within that. And they're also looking to develop a baseline product and production information system. So this is going to be notable for chlorothalonil, and I'll probably touch upon that a bit in that slide. And of course, there's also been the regular file tracking for product updates going on. In terms of 2021, there was approximately 49 Urmula registrations granted. And so far in 22, we're currently at about 22, and this has been on a range of individual crops and crop groups. Ontario has been a lead sponsor or key proponent of at least 70% of these registrations, which means a lot of our growers are being impacted by these, which is good. Some of the notable registrations include Velum Prime on garlic, Quadrus Flowable on globe artichokes, Elevate on dry bulb and green onions, as well as Select on green onions, leeks, and rutabaga. In terms of active minor use projects, we're still sitting at about 600 active minor use label expansions. So this is similar as to where we were at last year. So there's been a couple new submissions over the last year or so, but we're more or less at the same. Approximately 18% of these are joint projects with the USIR4 program. And of these 600, somewhere around 28 to 29% of these are minor uses for field vegetables. In terms of actual vegetable registrations, we're sitting at quite a few from 2021 to present. Notably for Muck vegetables includes Rymon or Novaluron on celery for tarnished plant bug and tarnished plant bug nymphs. Elevate or Fenhexamid for dry bulb onion and green onion for botrytis, as I mentioned earlier. And this is an interesting one, actually. It's a group, I want to say 17 or 27 perhaps. Anyway, it's been in the minor use program for almost 20 years. It was actually first selected back in 2004. So this one took almost 20 years to make it through. There was some deficiencies identified back in the mid 2000s, and they were finally addressed regarding some of the residues and environmental impacts. And this data was submitted in 2017, and we finally saw this come through probably about 4 months ago. So a new tool for botrytis management for onion growers is here. We have Select or Clethodim for use on green onions, leeks, and rutabaga for labeled weeds, as well as Aprovia Top, like we talked about earlier, for use on purple blotch, garlic rust, and Stemphylium on crop group 307. I did want to note on the label for this one, and a little bit different from what we've talked about today, but the label does recommend that if we're not targeting purple blotch on onions, the label actually recommends the use of just regular Aprovia, and this should help with some of the resistance management issues and rotation concerns due to the heavy reliance on those group 3s. So do keep an eye on that in your rotation plans for this year. In terms of emergency uses with Puridate, as I mentioned, we did submit this emergency use early last week, so late March. We do hope for a response by about late April or early May. We know it's been moving through the system already as some of the sponsorship fees have been accepted already. We did have near national participation in this, so there is great interest in this emergency use across the country, with all provinces participating with exception to Alberta. In terms of the pressure with Linuron, we are looking at a better situation than what we were at last fall. Current Linuron allotments are estimated to be around 60% of what we typically see for the 22 field season, which is an improvement as we were actually at one point expecting nothing to make it up. So we don't know where the allotments are going to land, but whether or not it's going to be a proportionate reduction in supplies for all retail outlets, or if it's going to be some dealers will receive their typical amounts and others none, we're not sure. But we're hopeful that if some retailers don't have enough or don't receive any, that this will help kind of ease that burden. The requested use pattern was 1 application per season, with prior to the weeds reaching 10 to 15 centimeters in height. And we've asked for a use rate of 0.5 to 0.75 liters per hectare for actively growing carrots in a 2 to 7 leaf stage. So for those of you on the call yesterday, this matches that mid-range that Clarence was talking about in his presentation yesterday afternoon. And we does specify in the label not to apply to the crop if there's any stress by nutrients, diseases, or insects and climatic conditions. So keep an eye on that. But as you saw in Clarence's data, it does look pretty promising. I wanted to say special thanks to a core group of partners for this one, including, but not limited to, because I'm sure I'm going to miss a few, but Matt Shepard, Kevin Vander, Kooi, Mary Ruth McDonald, Tyler Blauel, Dennis Van Dyke, Kristen O'Bead, Clarence Swanton, Darren Robinson, Chris Duyvelshoff, Nikki Taylor, Adam Vaughn, and Emily Falls all played large parts in the registration and kind of playing into the planning process for this. So thank you to you all and any others I may have missed on this one. In terms of the priority setting workshop this year, this wrapped up just about 2 weeks ago, yesterday actually. So the C priorities were held February 8th to 9th, the B priorities on the 16th to 17th, and the A priorities, like I said, 2 weeks ago. 18 selections were chosen 2 weeks ago, pardon me, and 6 joint IR4 projects will be selected at the food use workshop in September. We flew through both the B's and A priorities. The B's we got through in 1 day, and A's in approximately a day and a half, which was a little bit unexpected given the reduction in projects we saw this year. We came down from approximately 5,400 priorities and narrowed it down to, like I said, the 18 selections. There's also 2 organics and 5 regional selections selected as well. Of these final 18 mainstream priorities, 9 priorities are going to be chosen in the new capacity analysis this year. So PMC is going to take that list of 18 and look at what their current project dockets are and what kind of capacity they can have according to what was selected for the regional selections, as well as the organics and ongoing projects they already have. So the 18 projects selected are not final. I'll show these in the next couple of slides, but in the next couple of weeks, we will know what the final selections are. So here we go with the regional upgrades. We did see field peppers with anthracnose and caftan selected similar to the emergency use. And the Maritimes selected parsnips for labeled weeds with tuff. And as I mentioned yesterday, this is a bit of a workaround we have going on here. What's going to happen is Clarence's data will be submitted with this application at the same time. And PMC is going to be generating tolerance data on parsnips, but we'll be generating the residue data on carrots. And next year, we're hoping to select a use on radish. And this will allow us to submit for the full root vegetable group 1B in a couple of years' time when the data is completed. So we're hopeful that this emergency use on pure date will be accepted. And hopefully we'll be able to keep going with that and get that as a full use in a few years because of this. In terms of organic priorities, radish was selected with Pyganic, and this completes the crop root requirements for that since potato was chosen last year. Dry bulb onion and pure date was also selected, and the ministry will be running some garlic efficacy trials as well. And we'll be taking a similar approach to try and get this labeled on both garlic and dry bulb onion in a few years once those residue trials are complete. It is important to note too that, again, with this high demand for emergency uses, 4 of the 5 regional selections this year did address a emergency situation. So the pressure seems to be pretty great across the country with various diseases, but we're slowly trying to keep on top of that and make sure that we're not renewing these emergencies year after year. In terms of entomology and pathology projects, there was a few fruit and vegetable registrations. Notable vegetable ones included Harvanta for red-headed flea beetle on celery, as well as Sevia for use on Alternaria for both cabbage and broccoli. And these are the 2 rep crops for 5-13. So we're hopeful both of these get picked and will give us an additional management tool for Alternarias. We've been facing some difficulty since we lost a couple of those chlorothalonil uses a few years ago. In terms of chlorothalonil itself, as Chris mentioned earlier, this is a special review decision released back in February. The public consultation is currently open until May 11th and includes the proposed phase out of all outdoor and food uses due to unacceptable human health and environmental risk. As Chris mentioned, the important thing to note is that a lot of this is due to conservative data modeling. And for example, human health concerns were found to be okay based on the decisions made in the 2018 decision, but were instead driven by the potential for groundwater contamination identified in these computer models. So, you know, with Syngenta searching for real world data, we're hopeful that we can change and retain some of these uses. And it's important to note that this isn't a final decision yet. So all uses currently labeled are likely, well, they are okay for 2022. And unless the final decision is released, you know, immediately, we will still have these uses for a couple of years due to that phase out period that does associate with these final decisions. So 2022 is safe for Bravo applications, as well as 23, even if we see a final decision this year. But we do encourage all stakeholders to respond with the usage facts and figures to show what the impact of this proposed decision is. Special thanks to OFVGA for coordinating with the industry and developing the detailed use history with Syngenta and SIPCAM for each of the registered uses. All this information will help hopefully keep a couple of these uses that are critical to the industry. The important thing to note too, jumping back to the PM RAID decision, is that they're currently reopening and looking into creating real world data. So as Chris mentioned, with chlorothalonil and even mancozeb a few years ago, what we're often finding is that these proposed review decisions are coming out and canceling all uses and following intense feedback and provision of new data. We're oftentimes seeing PM RAID having to redo their review decisions, and this is essentially leading to a second review. So what PM RAID is looking to do over the next couple of years is develop a baseline for how growers are dealing with production on a year-to-year basis, and trying to figure out how growers are using products, how much of it, whether they're not using all their uses, all that kind of information. And hopefully they'll be able to have a detailed baseline to make these decisions with. We'll see what happens over the next couple of years while they develop this, and you may very well be contacted for feedback depending on which commodity you're growing for. But this is very fluid and just getting started. So we'll see where this leads to as we move through this new policy decision. In terms of current and ongoing minor use issues, some of you may recognize this kind of a title slide from Jim Chappett's past presentations, but I thought it continues to ring true, so I've updated it and added a little bit of stuff here. But the impacts of reevaluation decisions for numerous broad spectrums continues to be an issue, particularly chlorothalonil, mancozeb, chlorpyrifos, as Chris mentioned earlier as well. There's the new project capacity challenges at PMC. So, this year we're having a total of 22 projects with the food use workshop, whereas last year we were looking at approximately 38 projects. So moving forward, PMC is still consulting, and this was a pilot year, but this will continue to be an issue for industry over the next couple of years as we deal with this reduction in projects. So it puts more reliance on provincial minor use programs as well as the registrants to get these data sets completed. And we're looking at, at ways to address this and hopefully get the number of projects back up compared to what we saw this year. We continue to face the impact of invasive species as well as the impact of COVID-19 on current and future projects. Resistance management issues continue to be a problem, especially multiple herbicide group resistance, and more recently, numerous pathogens to group 11 fungicides, 3s, and 7s. There's the lack of effective solutions for difficult to control pests such as root maggots, wireworms, tarnished plant bug, bacterial diseases, and downy mildews. The cost of new products, new product development, as well as new technology availability. We just can't seem to keep up with resistance development, especially with their single sites. So we're constantly on the lookout for new products and actives, but there just doesn't seem to be quite enough to deal with the challenges we have some days. And lastly, there is a biopesticide technology gap that's kind of opened up in the last few years. And we're constantly looking for new products to bring up to market here and get into the hands of growers to kind of help address some of these resistance concerns. In terms of how you can help to contribute to the minor use program, I would just ask you participate in an annual minor use priority setting meeting each fall. I will reach out to each commodity and we'll set the provincial priorities every year as Jim had done in the past. Encourage your colleagues, and this includes growers and processors, crop consultants, researchers, etc., to participate in these calls to the meetings as well as to consultations such as with these reevaluation documents. Ensure provincial organizations are represented at the National Minor Use Meeting, and so that you can speak up to when decisions are being made and when we're trying to wean down these project selections. And when requested, please provide the detailed and accurate responses to emergency use situations, reevaluation data requests such as with chlorothalonil and the pesticide use surveys as needed. The minor use program, it depends on strong collaboration and frankly loud voices. And, this is important now, probably more than ever, especially as we deal with numerous challenges coming up. I don't know where I'm at for time here. I'm hoping I'm still within my limit, but if you have any questions, please throw them up in the chat, put your hand up, or feel free to contact me with my contact information here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh, for that update. I don't see any questions in the chat, so we will keep on rolling here with an industry update from BASF presented by Jillian Utter. Jillian, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'll get my screen shared here and we'll get going. Awesome. So hopefully everyone can see that. Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who do not know me, my name's Jill Utter. I'm the Horticultural Ontario rep for BASF. Most of you are probably a little bit more familiar with Tom Clark, and he retired at the end of last summer. So I've taken over for Tom in this area now. And I've been working with BASF in the horticulture division for about 5 years. So I'm looking forward to meeting everybody and working with you all. I thought today I'd kind of keep things nice and short and sweet and do a quick overview of a few of the BASF veggie crop portfolios and then dig into a couple of the fungicides very quickly. Okay, so here's the BASF lineup for root vegetables, a pretty nice fungicide portfolio there with lots of options to cover those tough diseases that you see in carrots and just help with your spray program and group rotations as well. And on to onions here. So of course, a few commonly used herbicides there. And again, a really nice lineup of fungicides to meet disease and chemical rotation needs. And then I'll briefly dig into Circatus here in my time slot, but I'm here for any burning questions that pop up as well. Okay, starting out with Circatus, which was mentioned in a few of the presentations earlier, and I'm sure the majority of you are pretty familiar with this product. Circatus is our standalone Group 7 fungicide. In the field, it has proven to be effective on Stemphylium and onions and is a flexible product in terms of tank mixing as well. The active ingredient there is fluxiperoxide, which is BASF has trademarked that as Xemium. The product is a liquid formulation, so really nice to work with, pretty flexible, and some information there on pack size as well. Just quickly kind of taking everybody back to a little bit of high school biology here, but essentially the product works through that blockage of complex 2 in the fungal mitochondria, disrupts that ATP production or energy production, and then the cell can no longer survive. Once that chemical applies, it kind of adheres to that leaf surface, that waxy cuticle, and translocates into the leaf tissue, and then from there travels into the xylem to protect that new tissue. Just kind of a visual to put together with all that sciencey stuff. The majority of that product on the leaf surface isn't taken up immediately. It actually binds pretty firmly to that waxy layer, creates these depots, and then from there, the product can be redistributed into the leaf, ensuring that continuous uptake. The product then kind of migrates towards the end of the leaf tips, which is why the product has really excellent systemic distribution. It is highly mobile in that xylem, so not all of the product moves directly to the leaf margins, but that's what allows that continuous and consistent protection. Okay, so for onions, the covered diseases here, botrytis leaf blight, purple blotch leaf blight, and then suppression of Stemphylium, which makes Circatus a really good rotation product and kind of that complete program for onions. Of course, we always recommend mixing those single sites with another mode of action for resistance management, and then re-entry period is 12 hours and pre-harvest is 7 days, so fairly flexible there as well. Just before I move on, Circatus, standalone Group 7, excellent systemic activity to protect that new growth and provide that consistent and continuous protection of tough diseases. Okay, switching gears a little bit to Maravon here. So this is the newest fungicide in our portfolio, and we launched this last season, saw some really good efficacy in the field. Maravon is a Group 11, Group 7. So the Group 7 here is the same active that we find in Circatus, kind of mentioned before there, which gives that product really good efficacy on a broad range of crops and diseases and provides really good, consistent protection. The Group 11 is pyraclostrobin, and that's what gives the product, it helps the product with managing some of those smaller plant stresses throughout the season. Again, a bit of a sciencey overview, but essentially what this shows us is the product has really good rain fast, moves nicely in that plant tissue, with that added benefit of plant health and stress tolerances with that additional Group 11. So a pretty wide label here. I'm just going to dig into the main vegetable crops today, but if anyone's interested to the label, lots of different crop groups covered here. For bulb vegetables, just remember that Maravon does have that group 7 component that's in Circatus in it. Wide ranges of disease here. The strengths are definitely that purple blotch, leaf blight, and with that xemium, it will pick up some activity on Stemphylium as well. Just remember when comparing that Circatus and Maravon in onions, it really comes down to the chemical group rotation and your targeted disease, what fits best into your program. And then carrots, those root vegetable crops, really good on alternaria leaf spot and powdery mildew, also a good Cercospora product. Just to remember, rotate those frat groups in your program, but Maravon has a really nice fit in carrots in terms of disease spectrum and that plant health benefit. Just before I turn it over here, kind of wrapping up, remember group 11, group 7 in Maravon, a wide range of crops and diseases. Very good, continuous, strong activity on a wide range of those diseases and kind of helps to manage those seasonal plant stresses. Okay, that's it for myself and BASF today, but if there's any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. My contact information is there just in case anyone wants to get a hold of me in the field this season. But thanks for listening. I hope everybody has a safe and successful growing season.
Great. Thank you, Jill, for the update. Next up is Mary Ruth McDonald. She'll be sharing some highlights from the onion research trials. Mary Ruth, the floor is yours.
Are you seeing my screen now?
Yep, it looks good.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff. Yes, I will be giving a research update of the work we've done in 2021 with going back some other years. But first, I do want to acknowledge the committee that puts together this conference, especially in years past when we had in-person meetings. The main committee was Matt Shepard, who you all know, myself, and Shawn Janse from the Muck station. And we needed a lot of help, of course, from all of the staff at the Muck station and the staff at the Bradford Co-op. However, in the last 2 years, when we've gone online, Vander has really taken a lead at organizing the program, contacting the growers, along with Dennis Van Dyke for technical assistance and setting up the Zoom meetings. And then this past year, Jeff Farintosh, who's chairing this afternoon, has also been very involved with technical assistance. So let's talk about onion research. The good news was that we were able to go ahead with all of our planned trials, working with the COVID restrictions. And I've got several different insects and diseases to talk about, starting with onion maggot. Most growers are familiar with the kind of damage that onion maggots can do. Hopefully you don't see too many of these bulbs that are completely full of maggots. But in 2020, we had very high maggot damage in our trials, as you can see here. And surprisingly, in 2021, the level of damage was really quite low. In 2021, we were very interested in trying a new experimental insecticide, a new mode of action, which is always a good thing. But I'll take you, in both years, we looked at several insecticides. FI 500 is the seed treatment that's available in the United States. Unfortunately, in Canada, we can only get the seed treatment with the 3 fungicides, F300, without the 2 insecticides, Regard and Cruiser. But we did test Cruiser by itself, Supresto, that you're probably all familiar with, and compared to Governor, which has been the standard for a number of years. And then we looked at this experimental product, both on the seed and in furrow. And all the seed was treated with Evergol Prime that you've heard about already a couple of times today. When we do the maggot damage, we mark out the assessment areas before any damage shows up, and also mark out areas where we're going to harvest the onions so we don't interfere with the harvest assessments. when we look at damage from first and second generation, and then another assessment at harvest. So the 2020 data, we did have lots of maggot damage. This is first generation damage, about 35% in the untreated check. Governor definitely reduced the damage, but if you look over here, Regard plus Cruiser and especially Suppresto were very effective at reducing maggot damage and protecting the onions. In 2021, so these shaded bars are the 2020 data. This is total season, so a little bit higher than the previous slide, over 50% throughout the entire season when no insecticide was applied. But if you look at the colored bars down here, these are 2021 results. And even the untreated check had about 5% maggot damage. All of the treatments were very low. Basically, Suppresto had no maggot damage at all. And the experimental on the seed looked good. In the furrow, not so much, but with this low maggot damage, it really wasn't a good test. We really can't say too much about the efficacy of this new product. We also looked at onion smut, because if smut kills the onions and maggot doesn't, that doesn't help a lot either. The smut fungus survives in the soil for a long time. It only germinates when onions are grown, so it just kind of sits there and waits. And cool weather in the spring results in the highest amount of smut. If it takes a long time for the flag leaf to get through the soil, then there's a greater chance that it will get infected. It usually kills most of the plants early on, but sometimes the plants grow and die throughout the season. So you're familiar with ProGrow. That was our standard seed treatment for a long time, but we were looking at Evergol Prime, Pemflufen, and comparing it with another potential seed treatment, Rancona. And with ProGrow, also included it with those 3 fungicides and far more, 300. And in this case, all the seed was treated with Suppresto to protect from maggot damage. So in 2020, again, relatively high smut in the untreated check, around 18%. Rancona and ProGrow were okay, but Evergol Prime, definitely the better product in this trial. And in 2021, much the same results. Disease pressure was a little bit less, but Evergol had 0 smut in this trial. So just wanted to reassure the growers that Evergol Prime is a very effective treatment for onion smut. So to recap a bit, unfortunately and surprisingly, low maggot damage in 2021, but over the years we've been able to show that Suppresto is very effective for protecting onions from maggot damage. We're still interested in this new product. We'll be looking at it again this coming year. And Evergol Prime is very effective for smut control. So you've already heard about downy mildew today. Cool, wet weather is when we see the most disease. We do go years without any downy mildew at all. As Tyler was mentioning, if there's morning fog, that provides the best conditions for infection to take place. And as Tyler said, the disease forecasting with downcast is very important because timing those first fungicide sprays correctly is essential. The plants can be infected for up to 2 weeks before we see any signs of disease at all. You can see some of the sporulation here with inside those circles. But if we show the same picture without those circles, you may get a sense of how difficult it can be to see the sporulation on the leaves, especially if there are only a couple of onions in the whole field with the disease symptoms to start. As the disease progresses, it can be a little bit easier to see this purple fuzz on the leaves. Morning is the best time to look for this, but again, it can still be hard to see in the early stages. As it progresses, the leaf dies, and sometimes we get purple spot or Stemphylium coming in and infecting the dead parts. And 2 or 3 cycles of sporulation and infection can really start to damage the onions. It usually starts in what we call hot spots. So you can have parts of the field where the onions are very healthy and a small area where they're really starting to die. And if it completely gets out of hand, it's extremely destructive. It can kill all the leaves in the field. There were still some bulbs on these, so disease probably came in late. Certainly wouldn't be able to apply MH to these onions, and usually infected onions don't store well anyway. So we've been evaluating fungicides for downy mildew for many years, even though we know some years we won't get any disease development. Ridamil MZ is certainly the standard, has worked well over a few decades. We're really fortunate that there are effective fungicides, Arondis, Sampro, that Tyler has talked about. We looked at a newer product, Viantis, biological, Serafil, another organic product, Prevam, which is orange oil, and Diplomab, which is considered a reduced risk product. And you've already seen these data, but I do want to emphasize again that there are several products here that tend to work very well for downy mildew control, as long as the first fungicide sprays go on at the right time. So we had no significant differences in these plots because the disease did develop sporadically. We had, even in our small plot trial, we had some areas that had no downy mildew lesions at all. But the downcast worked well. Onion downy mildew was found in an urban garden at the same time as our forecasting system was predicting sporulation and infection. And we are continuing to look at spore traps and adding more methods to improve downcast as we go along. And you've already heard quite a bit about Stemphylium as well, and seen some of these pictures. This is different. We need wet but warm weather for Stemphylium to really develop and cause damage. You may not see the early symptoms, but later on the lesions turn brown as the fungus starts to sporulate. And of course, it's the leaf dieback that really does the damage. There are some differences in cultivar susceptibility, but basically they're all susceptible. Some are just a bit more resistant or a bit less susceptible than others. You can see some disease developing here, where some of the other cultivars are still nice and green. If anyone's listening who wants to find out more about Stemphylium, there was this feature article recently published and available in Plant Disease. So I want to go back to some early work we did on fungicides for Stemphylium control. I think this was our first fungicide trial after we realized that Stemphylium was taking over, pushing out botrytis, basically, as the most important foliar disease on onions. So a lot of disease this year in the untreated, and we saw pretty good activity from the fungicides, Bravo, Mancozeb, Manzate. And if we look at this end, Luna Tranquility, Fontellus, Inspire were much lower than the untreated check. In 2017, the results weren't starting to look so good. Still relatively high disease in the untreated check, but nothing was any better than the untreated check, with the exception of Luna Tranquility. We're already starting to see that Quadris Top isn't giving us the control that we would like. So we started to look at some of the newer products. You've heard lots about some of these already today. and evaluating again some biologicals, T77 and the orange oil, Prevam. We also looked at alternating the biological with some of the fungicides. So you've seen some of these data before as well. But I do want to emphasize that while in 2020, we saw some reduction in disease, this is looking at the area under the disease progress curve. So it's giving us a number that encapsulates the entire season. When we looked at any specific date, we didn't see any differences. So this was a case where statistically we were seeing differences, but from a grower point of view, you wouldn't notice that there was any difference among these fungicides. Interestingly here, T77 was one of the better treatments, and even Prevam was not bad. But here's a picture of the trials. Just looking at those onions, they all look pretty healthy. It's really hard to pick out the untreated check from any of the other sprayed trials. So the data that you have seen, Miravis Duo gave us good results, but all of these with the A are essentially statistically the same. We did have Miravis with T77 in this trial, alternating sprays of the two products. And when we looked at yields, even though the Miravis alternated with T77 had a bit more disease, the yield was essentially the same as with Miravis Duo. So what's happening with these fungicides and why are we seeing all the changes over time? We've heard some of the issues with resistance to fungicides, and we've been looking at this as well as groups in New York State. The short story is that there was we were starting to see resistance a few years ago, and by 2020, basically all of the Stemphylium on the marsh was completely resistant to at least one of the materials in Quadras Top and one of the materials in Luna Tranquility, which helps to explain why we're not getting that effectiveness and also why we're no longer recommending that growers use either of these products to control Stemphylium. So yeah, starting in 2021, we recommend that avoid Quadras Top or Luna Tranquility. We don't expect them to work because of resistance. We're continuing to screen for resistance and to develop some baseline information for the new products. And we'll continue to evaluate some of the organic options and whatever combinations, whatever things we can think about to help reduce the development of resistance, including looking at some new technology, such as drop nozzles, to see if we can get better spray coverage and if that's going to improve the efficacy of these fungicides. So to wrap up, yes, there is fungicide resistance, and it is a real problem when it comes to controlling Stemphylium. Fortunately, a number of these new products still have some efficacy, but we're not seeing those big differences the way we do with downy mildew. It would still be great to have products that were even more effective. You've heard, and I just want to emphasize that the Evergol Prime, in addition to controlling smut, seems to be giving us a small improvement in the control of Stemphylium. And as Michael talked about, we still need a better disease forecasting system for Stemphylium, and that is part of our research program also. So again, a plug for our research report. It's on the website. And many thanks to the sponsors who provide funding, especially the Bradford Co-op and the fresh vegetable growers. And probably for the sake of time, there won't be time for questions, but I'll turn it back to you, Jeff.
Great, thank you, Mary Ruth, for those highlights from the research trial. Yeah, we can move on to the final presentation. Last but not least, we have Shawn Janse to share highlights from the 2021 onion cultivar trials. Shawn, take it away.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Just bear with me for 1 second. Oops. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about the onion variety trials that we did in 2021 here at the Muck station. We seeded the onion variety trial on May the 10th. We had 47 cultivars this year, well, pretty much a record high since I've been here. It's for entries, and they were from 9 different companies. We pulled the samples on September 13th, 14th, and 15th. We topped them on the 21st of September, and I did the evaluations from the 8th to the 30th of November. Germination this year was a bit slow, and vigor was, I would just describe it as fair. I've definitely seen better germination and much better vigor. The onions were pokey, I would think I would describe it best. Growth was steady and satisfactory. They certainly didn't have any major growth spurts. They just kind of plugged along through the whole entire season. Plant stand did get thinned out in several varieties. Looking back and looking at some of the seed treatments, it became pretty obvious that the treatments that had the Suppresto and Evergrow certainly outperformed other varieties that maybe were missing one of those 2 products. So it's definitely a boost to make sure your seed is treated with those products for really good, to give you a good start. Insects were kept at very manageable levels. Onion maggot this year was not too bad, and even the thrips. We did get a couple little peaks, but a couple good sprays and Movento in the mix, and it basically kept everything at fairly decent levels. Leaf diseases also were kept at manageable levels. Following the IPM recommendations, we did put on some products for Downy mildew, which kept control of that, so didn't have an issue there. And Stemphylium was kept at a manageable level throughout the season. There definitely was Stemphylium damage, but it was kept pretty manageable. And we also saw this year a few seeders pop up here or there. So sort of going through some of the highlights, ended up by the time we did evaluation or pulled them for evaluations, we did have poor yields. And it was also very apparent within the reps. Rep 1 was pretty good, Rep 2 was fair, and Rep 3 was poor in yields. Stand counts were at 6.6 onions per foot. The most predominant call that we found this year in the trial was peewees, or undersized. They had good neck finish, so they did mature. They were mature onions. We didn't have any issues there. Good color, although kind of like the carrots. They had good color, but there was some slight unevenness in color when you got them spread out at the evaluation table. And I would say too, the skin quality was still good, average, but it was slightly poorer than what I've seen over the last couple of years. So some of the trial averages, as mentioned already, 6.6 onions per foot, pretty much the same as was previous year. 966 average bushels per acre, which was a decrease. 3% onion maggot damage was quite a bit of drop compared to last year. We'll touch on that in a bit. It took about 108 days for the average onion in the trial to mature. It was actually less than it was in 2020. 8 for firmness. They were decent, but I did notice at evaluation that the firmness had decreased a little more than I thought they would have. And score quality issues was 6.89, which also was a bit of a decrease compared to the 2020 onions. Looking at the percent marketable, the trial average was 89.2. It was a decrease of 1%, so pretty much comparable to 2020. It ranged from 98 to a low of 76.51. Half the trial was higher than 90%. And again, the most common call was peewees. So the top 6 varieties as far as percent marketable out of those 47 this year, the number 1 was Switchback from American Tacky at 98% of the onions being marketable. Lodestar, also from American Tacky at 97.6%. Milestone from Tacky at 96%. Fortress, if you see a number behind the name, that represents the number of years it's been in the top percentage there, or top number, or top ones. So it's the second year now that Fortress has been in the top 6, and it came in at 94.1% of the onions marketable. And the last 2, 37-120 from Seminova at 94%, and LaSalle from Stokes at 93.8%. So some very common onions that we're all quite familiar with, again, showing to be some of the best onions, and why they are a lot of the onions that we're using right now. Looking at yield, so already the trial average was 966. It was down by 100 bushels per acre compared to 2020. Basically, at harvest time, it was becoming pretty noticeable that definitely the yield was going to be decreased compared to what I've seen. It's a little disappointing. It ranged from 1219 down to a low of 659 within one variety. Approximately half the trial was 1,000 bushels or better, so still okay in today's terms. It was about a 30-70 split in the size range. So about 30% of the onions at evaluation were between 3 inches and 2.5 inch diameter, and about 70% fell in the 2.5 inch to the 2 inch diameter. So slightly more on the smaller side as a whole, and that's probably why we had reduced yields. But looking at the top 6 varieties as far as yield went from the trial, Valencia from Bejo had the highest at 1219 bushels per acre. Number variety from Seminis, 7331 had 1219 bushels per acre. Nogal from Enzazetta at 1191. Another numbered variety from Enzazetta, I'll just leave it at that, 1187 in yield, being the 4th top yielding one in the variety trial of those 47. And the last 2 of the top 6 repeats from previous years, 1496, 3rd year that it made in the top 6 for yield at 1173. And Milestone, a very consistent one, making in the top 6 for 6 years now, from Taki at 1164. Looking at jumbos, or we consider anything over 3 inches a jumbo onion, the varieties that had the most amount of jumbos found within them, Scout from Crookham at about 31%, Switchback from Taki, 28%, a number variety from Hazara, 37,126 at basically 28%, Milestone from Taki at 26.5%, Nogal from Enzazetta at 25.5, and that one actually repeated from 2020, and Ridgeline also a repeat from 2020 at 25.1. Now the trial average was 11.4, and that actually was a decrease of 7%. And right away, if you think back to the other slide there, I showed we were about a 30-70 split on sizes, and that's also probably not surprising now that we have reduced amount of jumbo onions at last year's variety trial. Looking at scores or the quality of the onions, we base it on uniformity of shape and size, skin thickness, attachment and color, neck finish, overall, and an overall rating that I take. The trial average was 6.89, or good to average. It ranged from 7.75, which would be considered very good, to 5.46, which would be considered poor. The varieties that had the best score or the best qualities at evaluation, Fortress from Stokes, considered to be very good at 7.75, Trailblazer from Taki, Valencia from Bejo, Dawson from Bejo, Moderna from Bejo, and Patterson for the second time at 7.54. So those are the varieties that had the best quality. Speaking of quality, I did notice this year quite a bit of unevenness in shape and also slight unevenness in size. Looking at maggot damage, as a whole, maggot damage within the whole entire trial was quite low, only 3%, which is quite good. And we did not see a lot of loss of onions in the field from maggot. Again, a lot of these varieties had the Suppresto and Everglow treatments on them, and it really makes a difference, I believe. So the ones that had the least amount of onion maggot damage was 37,120 from Seminova at only basically 0.5% onion maggot damage. And this is rating anything in onion maggot damage that could be from a pinhole to a completely unmarketable onion. So we're taking a broad spectrum of looking at onion maggot damage. Stanley from Clifton at 0.7%, Valencia from Bejo at 0.7%, Powell from Bejo at 0.8%, Catskill from Seminis at 0.9%, and Heracchio with inoculum from Seminova at 0.9%. So all those were under 1% damage. Very few onions with any type of onion maggot damage found at evaluation. Now there are some varieties that had a little higher damage, and I'll just quickly go on those. Nogal was at about Patterson, Horecchio, Trident, and a number of variety from Enzazetta at rounding, finishing off at about 7%. Some of these varieties too may not have had the suppresso on it, so it could have been a factor in there. And again, the trial average was about 3%, which also was a decrease compared to 2020. Looking at the onion storage. So these are the onions from the 2020 season that we placed into storage. There were 33 varieties. There's in for about 44 weeks. So we looked at them in June, July-ish range. And just some highlights from the trial averages. The percent marketable was 66.5. It dropped 11% compared to 2020. Right away when I started doing the storage trial, you could tell that the quality of the onions and that the onions were not holding up well. Weight loss was at 7.2, about a 1.5% jump compared to 2020. Sprouting was at basically 22%, about a 10% increase from 2020. There was low amount of rot though, so it was more issues just on firmness and sprouting and that was issue on marketability than actually rot issues in the storage trial. And the firmness was average. They still maintained decent firmness. There was a low level of sprouting on the top and the root, but still what sprouting did occur did make them unmarketable. And the 6 varieties that had the best percent marketable onions when it was all said and done was Horecchio from Hazara at 88.7. And you can see there the marketable ones is a fuller bin onto the left side, and then the sprouting and a few little rot ones there on the right-hand side. Frontier was next best at 88% of them being still marketable after a storage period. Trekker from Tacky at 88%. Sat 1 from Seminova at 87.9%. And Safrain from Bejo at 87.3%. And Stanley from Clifton Seeds at 87.1%. So a couple of those names also probably very familiar with and realized too of being more of a storage onion, and that certainly showed up through the storage trial results. A couple of varieties that had the lowest amount, Outlander and Omega, both of them basically an early maturing onion, following the same line as Highlander. So not surprising that they didn't hold up well in storage. Now the ones that had the least amount of sprouting, Trekker only had about 1.2% sprouts occurring. Horecchio from Hazara, Milestone from Tacky, Frontier, and Fortress, and all of them being from 1.2 to 4% of the onions having a bit of sprouting, and that was it. Although the trial average again was almost 22%. So some of the other, probably the earlier maturing varieties and maybe some mids kind of bump that average up compared to the longer term storage onions. Those that had the least amount of weight loss, Sat from Seminova at losing about 5% over the course of the storage period. Stanley at about 5.6, Pocono, Safrain, and Trailblazer from Tacky at about 5.8%. And the trial average was 7.2, which was pretty reasonable. We've seen higher weight loss in previous years. So generally that's a good sign that the skins were of good quality, helping hold the moisture in, and also that the neck finish of those onions going into the storage were also quite good in keeping the moisture trapped in the onion and not letting it escape too much. Looking at firmness, or how hard they still were after they come out, anything basically about 7.5 or higher is still considered pretty darn good. So the varieties that had the best firmness after the end of the storage trial, some of these names we've seen already previously, it's for some other results, but Horecchio from Hazara at 7.8, Crockett from Bejo at 8, and that's the 3rd year that it's been one of the top ones. Trailblazer from Tacky at 8, Cartier from Bejo at 8.2, and Safrain 8.3. So a couple of those names too, again, you realize being more of a storage type onion. And the trial average was about 7. So all things considered, they still come out of the storage pretty good in firmness. Moving on to some red onion highlights. So I seeded this trial on March 24th as plug trace. We transplanted them on May 11th and 12th out in the field. We had 13 varieties from 7 different companies. And just so everyone knows, I did 2 seeds per cell for the plug trace. We pulled them on September the 13th. We topped them on September the 21st. I did the evaluations December 29th through to the first part of January. As a whole, for the red variety trial, germination and vigor was good in the greenhouse. We didn't really have any issues. They established quite steady. I wouldn't say they took off and grew like gangbusters, but they just continued every week. You could see improvement and growth in them. The entire season, basically, there was a steady growth, which I would describe as okay. Leaf diseases started early, but we're able to keep it at manageable levels, though there was some slight damage. And when I say slight damage, we could see some Stemphylium damage within the trial. The other notable thing was the red onion transplant trial. The rows were fairly noticeable all season long. They didn't really fill in to become a mat. So leaf material seemed to be a little smaller, and you could kind of see the rows clearly throughout the entire season. And in the reds also, we found a few cedars. So when it was all said and done, we had average yields. I personally was disappointed and hoping for better yields in the trial. It was just average. We did have low amount of rot. Sometimes reds you can have issues. We had low amounts of rot, low percentage jumbo cell. They really didn't size up, and that's probably why the yields weren't that great. Stand counts were about 5 a foot. They finished off really nice. They had good neck finishes and average skin quality though. Again, skin slightly poorer than what we had seen maybe from 2019 and 2020. Some trial averages from the red variety trial. Again, 5 onions per foot. The yield was about 10-13 bushels per acre, which actually was a bit of an increase compared to 2020, but not by much. 0.6% onion maggot damage. Again, literally nothing. Onion maggot damage was almost non-existent in this trial. Days to harvest was 93 days to harvest, slight increase compared to 2020. And firmness at 6.8, so a little more softer, not quite as firm as what we'd seen in previous years. And the score or the quality onions at a 6.5, just average. Percent marketable within the trial. The trial average was 95.4, pretty decent. Range from 99.1 to 83.9, so better than what we saw in the yellows. Half the trial was higher than 95.3. The most common calls, this got a bit more mixed, not quite as clear as the yellows. We had doubles, we had some rot, and a few undersized ones. But the top 6 varieties coming out of the red onion variety trial, as far as percent marketable go, is Red Wing was our best one from Beijing at 99.1% of the onions marketable. Red Mountain, our second one, at 98.7% of the onions being marketable. Ruby Ring, and that being the 4th year that it's been in the top 6, from Taki at 98.3. Red Bull from Beijing at 98.3. And finally, the last 2, Red Carpet, also the 4th year that it's been in the top 6 as far as percent marketable at 98.3. Red Stone, 2nd year from Beijing at just shy of 98%. Looking at yield, remember it was a little bit poor. Considering their transplants and red, you expect to see something a little bigger. The trial average was 10-13 bushels per acre. There was an increase of 120 bushels from the 2020. Even still, I didn't think it was that great in 2021, but obviously 2020 was even poorer. It ranged from 1195 to 710 bushels per acre. Approximately half the trial was 1,000 bushels or better. And the top 6 onions as far as yield go, Tanat with inoculum treated from Seminova at 1195. The 1298 from Seminis, numbered variety, at 1142. 2nd year that the 1298 was in the top 6 as far as yield goes from the reds. 4643, kind of a common red onion out there. We're all pretty much aware of it at 1135, and 4 years that it's been in the top 6. Red Mountain from Beijing at 1129. Red Bull at 1126, and Red Nugent, 4 years that it's been the top yielding one from Beijing at 1094. As far as jumbos, so again, we knew that some of these onions were a little more on the undersized, not quite the yield that we were wanting, but the varieties that had the best onions as far as 3-inch or better from the red onion variety trial was Tanat with inoculum treated to it at just 58.5% of the onions being 3-inch or greater in diameter. 4643 for the 3rd year, getting into the top 10 here, or top 6 at 52.1. Tanat from Enzazetta at 48.7. Numbered variety from Seminoles, 1298, second year that it's been in the top 6 at 46.8. Red Nugent from Stokes at 45.2, and Red Bull at 39.4. The trial average was 32.5, and that was actually up 12.5% compared to 2020. But again, I still thought the red onions were a little undersized for 2021. Could have been a little bit better. Moving on to scores in the red onion variety trial. So exact same thing that we look for in the yellows, we look at it in the reds, except we also consider red interior, how the interior of the onion is. So the trial average was 6.5, or average. It ranged from 8 good down to 5 being poor. The varieties that had the best score were Red Mountain from Bacterial at 7.3, are considered good. Red Wing, Tanat with the Inoculum from Seminova, Red Carpet, and Red Bull. So Bacterial seemed to score better on quality than anything else. A lot of that too, the Bacterial onions are quite nice in color, and they actually this year had quite nice skin attachment to them too. And the trial average was 6.5 overall. Looking at interior color, so just seeing how red it is, what is the center like, how red are the rings right to the center. The varieties that had the best interior color was Tanat with Inoculum from Seminova at 8.7, Red Stone from Hazara at 8, Tanat from Antizetta at 7.7, and Red Barrette from Crookham at 7.7, and the trial average was 7.3. Pretty much any of the red onions in the red onion variety trial had pretty darn good interior colors. Also now, compared to say 20 or 25 years ago, the red rings go pretty much right to the dead center. You may in some varieties see a bit of more whiter material in the first few rings, but the majority of the red onions have red rings, noticeable red rings right to the center. So I've just gone through quickly through the yellows and the red variety trials and everything. And as we've, been mentioning several times over the last 2 days, everything is in the green book. The green book is available here at the station if you'd like to come and pick a copy up. Tyler Scouts will be dropping off to all the IPM growers later on this spring. And of course, it's also available on our website. And just a little plug for the website. Also, we have our website. We also have our YouTube channel, and we also have Twitter. And this is a great resource of information for you guys out there. Everything from IPM updates, important IPM notifications, especially through Twitter, and the YouTube channel. The varieties from last year are on there. The Muck conferences from last year and this year will be on there. And we're hoping to build more onto that webpage as we go forward. And of course, I don't do this all by myself. Sorry for the quality of the picture, but Mishko and my summer student Madalena were key parts to getting all these variety trials in, looking after them for the entire season and harvesting them. So I thank them very much for all their help. And then finally, we just want to say, as Mary Ruth already mentioned, a special thanks to Kevin, who once again led and did the majority of the organization and setup of this virtual Muck conference. As last year, he did a fantastic job. And we also like to mention Dennis and Tyler and Jeff too, and all their help with that. It's been great as part of the committee to be able to slightly step back and let them take charge of this. And they've done a phenomenal job. I appreciate it very much. Also like to thank everyone that took their time to be speakers in the last 2 days. We appreciate them participating in the Muck conference, and we hope that they were of value to you out there. We also like to just thank you who watched. Thank you very much for taking time to participate in the Muck conference. We appreciate it very much. And finally, I'd just like to mention, most of you probably are aware, but we learned this past fall that Matt Volk, who was the research station manager from 1973 to 1989, had passed away. So he was very much a leader in extension here through that period of time. He did tons of things through extension to the growers, especially in the local area here. He led by leadership too, and also a big factor in the Muck conference in previous years and getting it going and getting speakers in and all kinds of other things going. So we just wanted to acknowledge and thank Matt for all the years of service that he did for us here at the Muck station, but also within the Holland Marsh. And he's certainly going to miss him very much. We heard that there's going to be some type of memorial in the summer. And when we do know more details of that, we'll make sure we put it on our Twitter and send it out, or in the Agrophone also. So And with that, I'll return it back to Jeff or Kevin, whoever's going to finish off. And I thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Shawn. I do have one more question here for you before you
Sure.
get off. They asked or said that you mentioned that Tanat was inoculum treated, and they're asking if that was treated with mycorrhizae.
So Seminova, I don't get 100% clarification on what their treatments are. They just have it down as inoculum. They also had another variety that had inoculum and mycorrhizae. So at that point, I would say no. The inoculum was a special treatment that they've done. It was not with mycorrhizae, because I had other ones in the yellow variety trial where it was the variety with their special inoculum, and then a variety with their inoculum and mycorrhizae. So in the reds, no, it was just their special inoculum, and you'd have to contact Seminova to find out exactly what their treatment is.
Okay, great, thank you. I think you're off the hook now.
No problem.
With that, I believe that concludes our program for today and the 70th annual Muck Vegetable Growers Conference. If you missed any of it, like Shawn mentioned, we have the YouTube channel, which is Muck Crops IPM. That'll be uploaded and should be live by tomorrow evening. Like Shawn said, I just want to reiterate and thank everyone for sticking around, presenters for such great presentations, and the organizers for putting it all together. I hope everyone has a great season and year ahead. Thank you.